They told us stories of knights gleaming beneath a forgiving sun, banners rippling in the breeze, swords flashing like silver promises. We were told they fought for honor, for faith, for beauty itself. But time, if you listen closely, tells another story. The sound of clashing steel fades quickly. What lingers is the whisper of something colder, a truth too quiet for the chroniclers to record. The myth of the noble knight was not born from battle, but from the ink of those who needed belief more than accuracy. The image of the knight was a creation of convenience. Kings needed symbols, the church needed saints who could bleed, and the people, weary from famine and plague, needed someone to worship someone whose courage could explain the cruelty of their age. So they painted him in light. They dressed him in gold and prayer, not mud and fear. The truth, however, was buried under the weight of story. For beneath the shining armor was a trembling man, hungry, indebted, often terrified. He did not fight dragons. He fought hunger, disease, and the slow corrosion of the soul. In the great halls, poets sang of valor, of battles fought for God and glory. But outside those stone walls, reality stank of blood and smoke. The knights who inspired such verses rarely survived long enough to hear them. They were broken before they were remembered, yet their brokenness was never drawn. A single clean stroke could erase the smell of death, the trembling of hands after killing. Propaganda does not tremble. It smiles, polished, unflinching. The illusion of the knight began not on the battlefield, but in the monastery. Monks, their quills scratching in candlelight, shaped memory to serve the powerful. A king's cruelty became divine will. A massacre became a victory. The church's ink did what swords could not, it sanctified war. Centuries later, those manuscripts would survive the men who bled for them. And so the lie endured longer than the lives it justified. Imagine a battlefield not of shining armor but of mud thick as tar. Men sink with every step. Horses scream. Armor that once glittered under sunlight turns black with rain and blood. The noble duel was a fantasy. Real war was chaos, a nightmare without rhythm or reason. Yet these men marched believing they were chosen. The illusion gave them purpose, even as it consumed them. Every generation inherited the myth and made it brighter, cleaner, safer. Even now, in films and games, the knight is still an emblem of purity, as though bloodshed could ever be beautiful. We still want to believe in gallantry, perhaps because we fear the alternative, that humanity's grandest wars were never divine, only desperate. The knight became a mirror for what civilization wanted to see. Courage without cruelty, violence without guilt, a moral disguise for survival. But the truth they erased is simpler, quieter, and infinitely sadder. Most knights were not noble. They were desperate men bound by debt or duty. Many sold their armor when coin ran short, or borrowed it from lords who would demand it back along with their lives. A knight's existence was not glory but endurance, endless campaigns, unwashed wounds, and prayers that no one would remember by name. The tales of honor served only those who watched from balconies, not those who fell in the mud below them. In candlelit chapels, priests blessed their departure. They spoke of eternal reward, of sins washed clean by courage. But those who returned brought home ghosts. They had seen too much to believe. Many could no longer pray, yet their silence was interpreted as stoicism, their emptiness mistaken for faith. History often confuses trauma with virtue. The fewer words a man speaks, the easier it is to imagine holiness. And so, centuries later, when the chroniclers compiled their stories, they stitched together fragments of illusion, one knight's discipline, another's tragedy. A third's imagined holiness, until the figure of the chivalric hero emerged, spotless and sacred. A sculpture of virtue built on corpses. The word chivalry itself was a salve, a way to perfume the stench of conquest. It whispered of ideals even as the bodies piled beneath them. If one looks closely at the oldest manuscripts, faint erasures reveal their secrets. Phrases rewritten, bloodied scenes softened, defeats inverted into divine lessons. In these faint scars of ink, we glimpse the manipulation. A king's scribe omits a betrayal. A monk changes a name. Over time, myth replaces man, and memory forgets the difference. That, perhaps, was the first weapon sharper than any blade selective remembrance. The myth endured because it was comforting. People need to believe that suffering means something, that every war carries a lesson worth the pain. The night provided that illusion, the idea that chaos could have purpose, that violence could be noble if performed in armor instead of rags. The lie soothed both ruler and subject. It told the poor that obedience could become glory, and told the rich that their commands were divine. Yet beneath the poetry and pageantry, something darker pulsed. The men themselves began to believe the stories written about them. Some died seeking the holiness promised to them, others trying to escape the weight of it. To live up to a myth is to lose oneself to it. The brightest armor reflected no truth, only the expectation of others. And when they fell, the chroniclers erased the dirt and blood, leaving behind only beauty. In the retelling, pain became courage, fear became faith, death became meaning. Every detail that made them human was gently brushed away. What remained was perfect and entirely false. Even now, the echo of that deception lingers. The knight, frozen in art and legend, stands, not as he was, but as we wish him to be. Unbroken, unafraid, untouched by doubt. But if you could strip away the paint and silence, you would hear the soft clatter of metal trembling in the cold, the muffled breath of a man realizing no prayer will save him. You would see that the light we imagine around him is not holiness. It is fire, reflected from burning fields. They called it glory. But what if the knights we praise were never meant to survive it? What if their suffering was the price paid for someone else's story? The armor shone not because it was clean, but because it hid what no one wanted to see. And as the legends grew brighter, the truth beneath them decayed, until all that remained was the shimmer of a myth, floating over 1,000 unmarked graves. In that silence, history became comfortable again, and the lie, now centuries old, still gleams in the dark. Soon, the story will turn toward the field itself, where no myth can hide, and the cost of belief lies scattered in the mud. They told them that their swords were sacred, that every man they struck down was one less sinner in the eyes of God. In whispered sermons beneath cathedral arches, priests promised that blood spilled in faith was not murder but redemption. And so, in the shadow of stained glass, warriors learned to pray before they learned to kill. It was not glory that drove them, it was absolution. The church understood the terror of sin more than any sword ever could. To control men, one must first control their fear of damnation. Every wound, every act of cruelty, was dressed in scripture. The priest spoke of divine purpose. The chronicler wrote of holy battle. Each word was a chain, binding the mind more tightly than any armor ever could. War was not merely permitted, it was sanctified. The cross became a weapon sharper than steel. But faith, once turned toward blood, could never remain pure. As knights rode beneath banners marked with holy symbols, they entered villages where prayers turned to screams. And still, the church told them they were blessed. The slaughtered were heathens, the burned were heretics, and the conquered were merely souls, freed from error. Such were the comforts of theology. In dusty abbeys, monks copied the chronicles that would become our history. They wrote of victory in language that glowed like sunlight, even when that light came from burning homes. Each massacre was a miracle, each conquest a divine sign. It was through these pens, not the swords, that holiness was manufactured. The monks did not lie outright, they simply described horror in the language of heaven. And with time, the blood washed clean beneath the ink. Imagine one of those knights kneeling before the altar after battle, hands still trembling, armor slick with blood. The priest places a wafer on his tongue and calls him forgiven. The man nods, though his mind still echoes with the cries of the dying. He tells himself the church cannot be wrong, that redemption must be real. To doubt is to lose everything. So he swallows faith like medicine, hoping it will numb what he has done. There are sermons that no one remembers, now parchment turned to dust, ink faded to shadows. But in fragments that survive, we see a strange logic repeated again and again. He who kills for God is cleansed by the blood he spills. Such lines were whispered across Europe, from pulpit to pulpit, until they no longer sounded like madness. The holy wars were not born from necessity, they were engineered, preached into existence by those who profited from the chaos. Faith became a kind of economy. Salvation was the currency. For every crusade called, indulgences were sold tickets to heaven for those who could afford belief. The poor gave their lives, The rich paid to avoid risk, and somewhere between those extremes, the knights themselves carried both guilt and privilege. They were the tools of a system that disguised politics as piety. Each war filled the coffers of the church while emptying the souls of the men who fought for it. Yet belief has a strange power. Even lies can comfort when they promise eternity. For many, death in battle was less frightening than the thought of eternal judgment. And so they marched, convinced that killing was a form of prayer. They wore crosses not as reminders of mercy, but as licenses for violence. They confessed before battle, as though absolution could be renewed like armor, ready for the next campaign. Still, something in them must have known. When the fires dimmed and the chanting stopped, silence returned heavier than before. Some knights built chapels of penance, their walls covered with carvings of the dead. Others wandered aimlessly, unable to pray yet terrified to stop. They had been made both executioner and believer, saint and sinner. What faith can survive such contradiction? The church's power rested not on God's voice, but on the fear of losing it. Every doubt was branded as heresy, every question as rebellion. The chronicles rarely mention the men who walked away, those who saw through the illusion. They left no glory behind, only silence. But perhaps silence is truer than all the hymns that followed. When we read those old texts today, they feel almost surreal tales of holy vengeance told with calm precision. The scribes never describe the stench of burning flesh, nor the faces of the children left behind. They write of purity restored, as though death itself were cleansing. Each page is a monument to delusion, yet beautifully written, designed to survive the ages. Perhaps that was the cruelest miracle of all, how easily beauty can preserve a lie. In many ways, this was the first great machinery of faith not to guide souls, but to justify power. The church crowned kings, blessed armies, and baptized war itself. And as long as the blood was shed in the right direction, heaven was said to smile. It was a contract between ambition and belief, sealed with scripture and enforced by fear. What, then, did it mean to be holy in such a world? If salvation could be bought with blood, where did sin begin and end? A man could burn a village by morning and kneel for forgiveness by dusk. The same hands that crushed lives could be anointed with oil by a bishop's blessing. In that cycle of sin and sanctity, morality dissolved into ritual. The church did not need to absolve them of guilt, it only needed to rename it. And so history remembers the Crusaders' banner but not the faces beneath it. The chroniclers spoke of triumph, not torment. The priests declared victory, not grief. What remained was faith forged in blood, hammered into shape by centuries of manipulation. Even now, its echoes remain. The idea that war can ever be righteous, that violence can be sacred, that those who command it stand closer to heaven than those who die beneath it. If heaven promised redemption, what did hell owe those who died for lies? The question lingers, unanswered, across time softer than prayer, sharper than steel. Perhaps there was never a single moment when faith became corrupted. Perhaps it was always this way, a fragile dream built on human need, reshaped by power, and reforged with every drop of blood spilled in its name. And beyond the cathedral walls, far from the comfort of Scripture, the battlefield waited silent, patient, indifferent. There, faith met its reflection, and the truth began to crawl from the mud. They said the field was holy ground, but it smelled only of rot and fear. The morning mist hung low, soft as a shroud, disguising what lay beneath. From a distance, it might have seemed peaceful, a quiet valley, green and endless. But up close, the earth told another story. The soil was thick, wet, and red where it should not have been. Each step sank into the remnants of what once was flesh and courage. The air itself seemed alive, heavy with the metallic scent of iron and decay. It was not a place of heroes. It was a grave that never stopped feeding. When the sun rose, it revealed the truth that darkness had kindly hidden. Mud glistened like oil. Armor reflected a dull light, scarred and cracked from yesterday's violence. Men shifted, muttering prayers that had already been ignored. Some crossed themselves, others kissed amulets, though both gestures trembled with the same fear. 1,000 voices murmured at once, not of faith, but of exhaustion. The banners above them were torn, their bright colours drowned in filth. No one sang. Songs were for men who expected to return. The sound began long before the charge. It came like weather distant, unstoppable. The thud of hooves, the drum of marching boots, the clatter of steel against shields. It built slowly, like thunder gathering over the horizon, until the world itself seemed to shake. A knight adjusted the strap of his helmet, feeling sweat drip down his neck, mixing with dirt. His heart hammered so hard it became part of the noise. Around him, men tried to look brave. None succeeded. When the first clash came, it was not glorious. It was confusion made solid. The sharp ring of metal met the wet sound of flesh tearing, and for a moment no one knew what was happening. Orders dissolved into screams. A rider went down, his horse collapsing over him, its body twitching. A soldier stumbled in the mud, his hand slipping on blood instead of water. The field became a storm of sound, groaning, shouting, choking, praying. Every man swung not for honor, but for breath. They say the smell of a battlefield is unforgettable, and they are right. It is not only blood, it is sweat, excrement, burnt hair, and the sourness of fear itself. It clings to the skin, to the mind, to memory. No wind carries it away. Even those who survived would later say they could taste it when they tried to eat, smell it in clean water, hear it whisper in sleep. This was the real perfume of war, the scent of men dying for an illusion too fragile to name. Time on the battlefield was strange. Minutes stretched into eternities, while entire lives ended in heartbeats. The world narrowed to what a man could see through his visor. A sliver of sky, a blur of motion, the glitter of a blade. He did not see enemies, only shapes that wanted him gone. Every strike was survival, not strategy. In that chaos, the idea of chivalry vanished. There was no mercy, no prayer, only instinct. The knight who once vowed to protect the innocent found himself striking blindly, too afraid to recognize faces. In the thick of it, sound became meaningless. The screams were so constant they blended into a single endless cry. Orders shouted by commanders were lost to wind and terror. The horses panicked first, sensing what men refused to admit. Their neighs turned to shrieks, echoing through the fog like the cries of something ancient and wronged. The battlefield was not a place for the living. It was a ritual of dying repeated too many times to matter. And still, men fought, because stopping meant facing what they had done. Better to swing again than to think, better to drown in noise than in guilt. The body took over where faith failed. Muscles remembered what the soul could not bear. Each blow was heavier, slower, more desperate. Blood turned the earth to sludge, and that sludge clung to their legs like judgment. There were no victors, only survivors. When at last the fighting waned, silence fell like ash. The fog returned, merciful, to hide what the day had shown. Here and there, the wounded moaned softly, their voices smaller than the wind. A knight sat down beside a fallen friend and could not tell whether he was alive. He tried to pray, but the words slipped away from him, meaningless syllables against the vast indifference of the field. For the first time, he realized that no sermon had prepared him for this. The chroniclers would later call it a triumph. They would speak of divine favor, of enemies crushed beneath righteous steel. But none of them stood here, knee-deep in the truth. They did not feel the bodies twitch beneath their feet, nor the warmth of blood seeping into the soil. They would never know how war sounded when it stopped the hollow quiet, broken only by flies. Those who survived would never speak of it fully. They could not. Words were too clean. At night, the stars looked down as they always had, cold and unjudging. The survivors built fires that barely burned through the damp. No one celebrated. They sat in silence, staring into the flames as if searching for something to believe in again. One man tried to clean his sword, but the stain remained, spreading like rust that came from within. He realized then that the weapon had outlived its purpose. It no longer symbolized courage, only endurance. They had been told they were chosen, that their suffering was divine. Yet in the emptiness after battle, even faith felt like a trick of the light. Heaven had been silent while men screamed. The field that was promised as holy now reeked of everything unholy. The crows descended early, wise as ever, their black wings brushing against broken banners. And still, the chroniclers would never write of this smell, this silence, this truth. They would speak instead of victory and valor, of sacred duty fulfilled. But here, in the mud, the myth drowned. The ground itself rejected it, swallowing the bodies and the lies together. The knight removed his helmet and looked across the ruin, the endless churn of shadow and bone. He thought of the promises made before battle, of honour, of God, of glory. They sounded like children's tales now. There was only the cold breath of the wind, the hum of flies, the steady pulse of regret. He understood, perhaps too late, that the stories were never meant for men like him. They were written for those who would never smell this field. And as the night crept back over the valley, the fog thickened once more, closing gently over the wounds of the day. The world exhaled. The earth was quiet again, but not clean. The field was holy, they had said, yet holiness had long since fled. What remained was only mud, iron, and fear. They returned home as ghosts, long before they died. The war had ended, at least in the words of kings and chroniclers, but for those who had lived through it, the noise never stopped. It followed them into their sleep, into their prayers, into the silence of their own breathing. The world looked the same, yet something essential had been burned away, not by fire, but by what they had seen and done. They carried the battlefield within them, as if the mud had never truly let them go. In villages, wives and mothers wept at the sight of returning men who no longer recognized their own homes. Some stood at the threshold, unable to cross it. Others spoke to no one for weeks, staring into the hearth as if waiting for orders that would never come. Their children learned to tiptoe around them. For a sudden sound, the creak of a door, the cry of a bird could summon rage or terror. To the church, these were not wounds of the mind. They were seen as spiritual corruption, whispers of the devil inside the soul. Confession became exorcism, mercy became diagnosis. The priests wrote of visions that plagued former nights, shadows appearing at night, voices calling from unseen places, the smell of blood that came from nowhere. They called them temptations or hauntings, not knowing that what they named as demons were only memories. The church's language had no room for trauma. Sin and salvation were its only measures of a man's soul. And so those who trembled, those who screamed in their sleep, were told to pray harder, to scourge themselves clean. Some did. Some prayed until their knees bled, waiting for peace that never came. One account tells of a knight who confessed every dawn for 40 days, terrified that the screams of dying men were the voices of devils dragging him toward hell. The priest assured him that faith would cure him, but faith was what had sent him there. Another story speaks of a soldier who refused to remove his armor for months, even in bed, certain that death waited just beyond the touch of air. He died of fever, clutching his sword as if it still had meaning. These were not rare stories. They were only the ones someone bothered to write down. Others took their guilt on the road. Pilgrims, they called them men, walking barefoot across Europe to holy shrines, begging for forgiveness no one could grant. Some wandered for decades, driven by dreams they could not explain. They sought relics to touch, miracles to believe in, signs that heaven had not abandoned them, but miracles were scarce. For every saint's bone or sacred spring, there were 100 frauds waiting to sell hope to the broken. Even faith, in the end, became a market for pain. At night, in monasteries or roadside chapels, some knights scribbled their own confessions on scraps of parchment. Their words were not heroic. They were quiet, trembling, human. I saw his eyes before he fell. I hear them still. The ground remembers. These fragments, forgotten for centuries, speak more truth than any chronicle of victory. They are the real history, written not in triumph, but in aftermath. But the age had no name for what they suffered. Madness, possession, melancholy, these were the words used to contain what no one wanted to understand. Doctors prescribed leeches or cold baths. Priests prescribed prayer. None could drain the images that clung to the mind like ghosts. And so, slowly, the men withdrew, some to monasteries, some to alehouses, some to silence. Their bodies returned, but their spirits stayed behind, trapped between faith and horror. In the eyes of the living, they became strange creatures, neither sinners nor saints, but reminders of something everyone wished to forget. Villagers avoided them, whispering that war had left a mark deeper than scars. Perhaps they were right. These men had looked into a kind of darkness the world was not built to comprehend. To live among those untouched by it was to feel invisible, as though the world had moved on without them. They began to dream differently. In their sleep, the battle returned not as noise, but as repetition. The same moment, again and again, the face of a dying friend, the glint of a blade, the cry of a horse. The mind tried to rewrite what had happened, to find a way it could have ended differently. But memory does not forgive invention. It replays until belief fractures. Some awoke screaming, some awoke calm, as if numbness were mercy. Some never woke at all. The church, sensing unease among the faithful, began preaching about the holy burden. They told people that suffering was proof of divine testing, that those who carried visions were closer to God. It was a convenient truth, for it silenced the broken and exalted their pain as virtue. Yet beneath those words, the reality was far simpler. These men were not saints, only survivors. They did not need glory, they needed rest. A few found it in the simplest acts: planting crops, mending tools, listening to the rhythm of rain instead of war drums. The world itself seemed to teach them how to breathe again. They no longer looked for God in the cathedral's echo, but in the quiet pulse of ordinary life. Yet even in that peace, the memories lingered faint but persistent, like a scar beneath healed skin. Sometimes they would pause in the middle of work, as if hearing something distant, a remembered cry, the clang of unseen steel. Then they would shake their heads, mutter a prayer, and return to their labour, pretending it was only imagination. Not all found peace. Some turned bitter, their faith corroded by what it had asked of them. They spoke blasphemies in taverns, calling priests liars and kings thieves. Others drifted into mercenary bands, drawn again to the one thing they understood: violence. Better the certainty of battle than the uncertainty of living among those who could not comprehend it. For them, peace was not an end, but a punishment. The world beyond war felt smaller, less real. They did not fight for ideals anymore, nor for God, but for the familiar noise that drowned their thoughts. For those who survived both war and silence, there was no redemption, only endurance. The mind learns to adapt to horror by folding it inward, like paper hiding a message no one should read. In time, they stopped speaking of what they had seen. They let the myths grow again, stories of courage, of holy victory, and said nothing to contradict them. Perhaps they understood that truth could not be told to those who had never smelled that field. They returned home as ghosts, long before they died. And though the years passed, the battle never truly ended. It lived behind their eyes, in the hollow of their breath, in the nights they could not sleep. The church called them holy, the people called them cursed. But perhaps they were simply the price that every myth demands: the living proof of what happens when faith and fear share the same wound. Soon, others would rise to take their place. Men who no longer fought for crowns or causes, but for coin. The age of belief was fading. What remained were those who had learned to live from war itself. When peace became unprofitable, men learned to pray for war. The sound of steel no longer echoed for honour or faith, it rang for payment. The knight, once imagined as a holy servant, became something else entirely, a contractor of death. Behind every crusade and border skirmish, behind every banner of righteousness, lay a ledger. The age of faith had discovered arithmetic, and the numbers were written in blood. The transformation was subtle at first. A kingdom needed soldiers, a man needed coin, oaths grew lighter, promises thinner. A lord's cause mattered only as much as his purse. Men who had once sworn loyalty to their liege began swearing to whoever could afford them. It was not treason, it was survival. The church still spoke of divine purpose, but in the camps and taverns, everyone knew the truth. Gold was the only god who paid on time. Across Europe, mercenary companies began to appear like a new kind of order, not religious, not noble, but entirely practical. They called themselves free companies, though freedom was an illusion. They were bound not by law, but by need. Their captains were businessmen more than warriors, negotiating contracts with kings, bishops, or even rival armies. One day they fought for a crown. The next, they defended the men who had tried to kill them. The sword had become a tool, not a vow. Villagers watched them pass with dread. To hire a mercenary army was to invite ruin, for they demanded payment whether they fought or not. When kingdoms ran out of coin, these companies took what they were owed in land, livestock, and flesh. Entire regions were bled dry, not by war itself, but by the men who made war their livelihood. Peasants fled fields before harvest, hiding in forests as soldiers turned their homes into fortresses and their grain into profit. To those above, it was strategy. To those below, it was famine. The chroniclers rarely mentioned the invoices, the debts, the bribes that moved armies across borders. They preferred to speak of valor, of banners glinting beneath heaven's gaze. But in the letters exchanged between kings and captains, a colder language ruled. Battles were not decided by courage. They were negotiated like trades. If a victory cost too much, it was postponed. If a defeat could save money, it was accepted. The battlefield had become a marketplace, where lives were the cheapest commodity. Even the church, for all its sermons, was not immune to this arithmetic. Bishops blessed wars that enriched their cathedrals and condemned those that threatened their estates. Indulgences were sold to finance crusades. Relics were pawned to feed armies. The holy and the profane shared the same treasury. Gold moved faster than grace, and both were measured by weight, not worth. When the coins ran out, the wars often did too proof, perhaps, that piety alone was never the engine driving them. Among the soldiers themselves, cynicism became its own faith. They stopped pretending to fight for glory. Around campfires, they joked that heaven charged admission. A man's worth was not in courage, but in how much he could earn before dying. Captains kept lists of spoils owed, priests kept lists of sins forgiven, and both seemed equally negotiable. The line between salvation and profit blurred until it was invisible. The mercenary life promised freedom, but delivered exhaustion. Men who sold their swords learned quickly that their souls were part of the price. To desert meant starvation. To die meant debt for one's family. Contracts were written in ink but sealed in fear. Some captains became rich enough to buy titles, even kingdoms, but most soldiers died nameless, their bodies unburied, their wages unpaid. They were assets until they were corpses. Then they were forgotten. The irony was cruel. Those who profited most from war never risked the field. In distant halls, nobles and bankers toasted victories they had purchased but never seen. The blood of others became a currency of power, something to spend lavishly from the safety of stone walls. They sent messengers, not sons. And when the war ended, they bought peace as easily as they had bought violence. The same hands that funded slaughter funded reconstruction. War and peace were simply two sides of the same coin, flipped by those who owned it. One might think such a world would collapse under its own corruption. But commerce is adaptable. Even ruin can be profitable. Armies destroyed towns only for merchants to sell the wood and stone to rebuild them. Plagues followed campaigns, and healers charged a price for hope. Every death fed another's gain. Humanity, it seemed, had discovered how to monetize suffering. And yet, for all their pragmatism, even the mercenaries could not escape the myths that birthed them. They still painted crosses on their shields, still whispered prayers before battle. Not out of faith, but habit. Some said it was easier to believe they fought for something holy, even if they no longer remembered what that meant. When a man kills for coin, he must find another name for his hunger, otherwise he risks seeing himself too clearly. There are letters hidden in archives, ignored by historians, that reveal the cold humour of their trade. One mercenary wrote to his wife, "They promised we fight for God. I have yet to see him pay." Another noted, "The king owes us wages. Perhaps he will remember when his castle burns." Their wit was the last defence against despair. When everything sacred had been sold, irony was the only truth left affordable. Even kings came to fear the armies they hired. A soldier loyal only to gold cannot be dismissed, only outbid. Some mercenary captains became so powerful they held monarchs hostage, demanding ransom from their own employers. Thus, the crown learned that gold could buy obedience, but never control. War had become a living creature, feeding on the hand that fed it. And still, it continued because it worked. The machinery of blood and coin kept turning, grinding down those trapped within it. The common people wept for peace, but peace could not pay the debts war created. There were always borders to redraw, faiths to defend, enemies to invent. The illusion of purpose kept the business alive. As long as men could be convinced that their cause was righteous, the price of their labour and their lives remained justifiable. When peace became unprofitable, men learned to pray for war, not to God, but to the merchants, kings and priests who decided when heaven required another campaign. The sword was no longer a symbol of courage, but a receipt. And those who carried it knew perhaps better than anyone that history would never tell their story honestly. It would speak of strategy, not starvation, of victory, not vacancy, of honor, not hunger. But if one listens closely between the lines of those old chronicles, one can still hear it, the rustle of contracts, the whisper of coin changing hands, the quiet arithmetic behind every triumph. The war never truly ended, it simply changed its accountants. And somewhere beyond the smoke and ink, the real masters of conflict waited those who learned to profit from death without ever touching a sword. Every sword that fell was paid for by someone who never held one. Beneath the noise of clashing armies and burning cities, there existed another kind of battlefield, one with no blood, no banners, no cries of mercy. Its soldiers were not men in armor, but men in robes and silks, counting coins in candlelight. Here, victories were not measured in land or faith, but in balance sheets. And while others died for causes they barely understood, the true masters of war stayed warm, hidden behind the illusion of purpose they had crafted. In this unseen world, kings were pawns. They ruled, yes, but only within the limits their lenders allowed. Crowns were expensive things to maintain. So were armies, castles, and crusades. When gold ran short, as it always did, the monarchs turned to those who could conjure it from thin air. Papal treasuries, banking houses, and noble creditors stretched invisible threads across Europe, binding every throne to their will. It was said that wars began not with drums, but with signatures that treaties of death were written in ink long before the first trumpet sounded. The Church, that eternal arbiter of salvation, was among the wealthiest of these patrons. Through indulgences and tithes, it collected fortunes in the name of forgiveness. The same coin that cleansed sin could also fund slaughter. The papal banks financed crusades with one hand and traded with their enemies through the other. Faith became a currency, pure and infinitely renewable. No matter which army triumphed, the Church's ledgers always balanced in profit. Salvation, after all, was recession-proof. Then came the merchants-men of Florence, Genoa, Augsburg, who learned to make war into an investment. They loaned gold to both sides, secured not by honor but by interest. To them, blood was collateral, and defeat was merely a delayed payment. Letters of credit travelled faster than soldiers, ensuring that profit arrived before peace ever could. The names of these financiers rarely appeared in the chronicles. History does not favour those who never risk the sword. But their silence was not humility, it was strategy. The less they were seen, the more they controlled. In private chambers, the world's fate was discussed over parchment and wine. Nobles traded territories like merchants traded spices. A border war here, a revolt there, all could be arranged for the right price. Sometimes an entire kingdom was destabilized simply to collect the debts of a rival. The chaos that bled peasants dry filled the vaults of those who orchestrated it. War to them was not a tragedy. It was a portfolio. Even the holy orders were not exempt. The Knights Templar, those supposed guardians of the cross, became Europe's first great bankers. Pilgrims entrusted them with their gold. Kings borrowed from them to fund their crusades. Their temples were not merely sanctuaries, they were treasuries. And when their wealth grew too vast, when their influence threatened the thrones they once served, the same church that blessed them turned against them. They were accused of heresy, tortured, and erased. But their methods survived, absorbed, imitated, and perfected by those who had envied them. Behind every banner, there was an emblem no soldier ever saw, a seal stamped on parchment, a crest embossed on a coin. These were the true symbols of power. The battlefield was theatre, the soldiers, actors, and the financiers, the playwrights, who decided how the story would end. For every knight who fell, a noble somewhere toasted his bravery and calculated his worth. For every village burned, a banker tallied the rebuilding cost. And for every crown that claimed victory, another crown collected the interest. There are letters, rarely read and never quoted, in which popes and kings negotiated the value of blood as if discussing trade goods. A certain campaign might cost 10,000 men, but yield 5 provinces. Acceptable losses. Another might risk excommunication, but promise an increase in tithe collection. The logic was impeccable, the morality irrelevant. In the ledgers of power, life was a figure that could be rounded down. Even alliances were illusions. Enemies funded one another through intermediaries, and peace treaties were often designed to fail. Conflict kept the economy alive. The weaponsmith, the priest, the banker, all relied on the same endless cycle. And so, wars were born not from hatred, but from habit. Each generation inherited debts that only new blood could pay. It was the perfect system, self-sustaining, profitable, and blessed by divine rhetoric. The chroniclers called these wars holy, righteous, or necessary. But the invisible masters had no need for such poetry. They spoke in numbers, not miracles. When a king hesitated to march, a loan reminded him of his obligations. When an army faltered, mercenaries filled the gap, paid from purses opened in foreign cities. Every rebellion, every crusade, every skirmish in the name of God or crown, all of it traced back to a small circle of hands that never touched a sword. And yet, these hands shaped the world more profoundly than any weapon. The borders of nations, the rise and fall of dynasties, the myths we still tell of heroism, all were moulded by the quiet accountants of fate. The church's sermons spoke of eternal life, but its bankers ensured eternal war. The nobles toasted peace in public while investing in conflict in secret. No king could escape them, because no king could rule without them. Gold, not faith, was the foundation of divine right. Some tried to resist. A few monarchs attempted to fight wars without borrowing and fell swiftly into ruin. Armies deserted, castles crumbled, treasuries emptied. The lesson was learned. Independence was fatal. Power demanded partnership with those who could afford it. From then on, every throne came with invisible advisors, men whose wealth granted them the power to decide when heaven itself required more blood. There is a peculiar irony in the way history remembers them. The chronicles are filled with the names of warriors and martyrs, kings and prophets, but not one of these invisible masters is ever praised or cursed. They vanish behind the curtain, leaving only their consequences. Perhaps that was their greatest triumph, to write history without appearing in it. Every sword that fell was paid for by someone who never held one. Every victory was the dividend of a hidden investment. And as generations passed, the pattern solidified into something resembling fate. War became predictable, almost ritualistic, a pulse that rose and fell with the ebb of gold. The masters needed no armies of their own, only the illusion that others were fighting for something sacred. From this web of silent power emerged a truth both simple and cruel. War was never about belief. It was about balance, not of justice, but of accounts. And while soldiers died for causes, their deaths were quietly counted as profit. The men who orchestrated this never needed armor, for their walls were built of trust, their weapons were contracts, and their banners were blank. And far below, in the mud and hunger of the camps, the soldiers continued to fight, unaware that the hands which commanded them were soft, perfumed, and uncalloused. Their misery was not accidental, it was calculated. For every debt repaid, another was created, ensuring that no man of the sword would ever run out of work. Soon, the story will turn back toward them, the ones who bled, not profited. The invisible masters have written the script, the soldiers will live it. And in the pages ahead, their suffering will reveal the true cost of serving empires built on coin. Beneath every polished plate was a man praying his armor wasn't stolen. The stories told of knights as paragons of grace, steel-bound saints riding beneath banners of faith. But the truth was not forged in gold, it was stitched in filth. The gleam that poets praised was not the light of virtue, it was the residue of survival. Beneath the armor, skin festered. Beneath the glory, hunger ruled. And beneath the silence of those great armies, there were coughs, groans, and whispers of debt. The weight of armor was more than metal. A full suit pressed against the body like a second skin, trapping heat and sweat until it felt like drowning upright. By midday, a man's breath tasted of iron and rot. The chafing of chainmail carved raw wounds into his shoulders and thighs. The smell of unwashed linen mixed with horse dung, mud, and blood. The same steel that was meant to protect could blister and infect. Yet knights wore it proudly because without it, they were nothing. A man without armor was not a knight, he was prey. Few could afford such protection outright. Most borrowed their armor from lords or creditors, signing their lives away for a suit that would outlast them. Some pawned pieces to pay for food, fighting with mismatched gauntlets or rusted helmets. Others stripped the dead to replace what they'd lost. The same armor that symbolized honor became a mark of desperation, a reminder that the illusion of nobility was always one payment away from collapse. In the tents between battles, life was a slow decay. The air hung heavy with smoke and unwashed bodies. Rats nested in saddlebags. Fleas moved freely between men and horses. Food was scarce, and when it came, it was foul hard bread, salted meat, and whatever could be scavenged. Wine was safer than water, but it dulled the senses, and many drank simply to forget. Those who didn't became gaunt, hollow-eyed, their ribs pressing against the fabric of their tunics. To survive was not to fight bravely, but to eat before another did. Debt haunted them like a second shadow. For every battle won, there were levies, taxes, and loans of loyalty waiting at home. The church demanded tithes for their salvation. Their lords demanded payment for their gear. When war ended, poverty began. Some knights took to robbing travellers or selling their blades to any cause that could pay. Others became enforcers for the very nobles they once despised. The code of chivalry was a luxury they could no longer afford. Hunger makes heretics of everyone. When rain came, it was both blessing and curse. It cooled their fevered skin but turned the camp into a swamp. The trenches filled with muck, swallowing boots, soaking bandages. The wounded lay half submerged, whispering prayers for death that might not come. Flies gathered faster than priests. Disease spread through the ranks, like rheumatoid dysentery, fever, rot. A single infected wound could end a life more quickly than any sword. Yet no one spoke of these deaths. The chroniclers left them in the margins, as if the unheroic could not be remembered. The nights were worst. The fires dimmed, and the world sank into murmurs and stench. Men lay side by side, wrapped in damp cloaks, listening to the wheeze of the dying. Some muttered half-forgotten prayers, not to God but to luck, to ghosts, to whatever might still be listening. Others whispered about home, the sound of rain on a roof, the smell of bread, a wife's laughter. They shared these memories quietly, as if speaking them aloud might anger heaven. But in those fleeting recollections, something human flickered, a reminder that they had once been more than soldiers. There were small mercies too, the kindness of a squire washing blood from a blade, the sound of distant bells carried on the wind, the rare warmth of sunlight after weeks of grey. But such moments vanished quickly, swallowed by duty. Each morning began the same way, armour donned like penance, eyes dulled by fatigue. The clang of helmets closing over faces turned them into something less than men, more than prisoners. They became machines built of fear and obedience. The myth of knighthood never mentioned the sores, the lice, the stink of leather soaked in sweat. It never spoke of men waking in panic, certain that someone was stealing their boots or their last crust of bread. It never showed the trembling hands that held the spoon, or the silence that fell when someone's cough turned wet with blood. History prefers symbols, not symptoms. The knight was easier to worship when stripped of his humanity. There was no rest, not even in prayer. The church's promises of divine favour rang hollow in the mud. Some priests passed through the camps to collect confessions, but most were too afraid to stay. Those who listened heard little of sin and much of exhaustion. Men confessed not to murder, but to doubt. They no longer feared hell, they feared waking another day in armour. A few priests absolved them. Most offered scripture and moved on quickly, unwilling to look too closely at what faith had become. Even the strongest spirits fractured. Some knights began to see omens in everything. The flight of birds, the shape of clouds, the echo of distant thunder. They sought meaning in the smallest details because the world around them had lost all sense. Others abandoned belief entirely, becoming ghosts within their own skin. They followed orders, swung swords, ate when told, and forgot how to feel. The line between living and enduring blurred until neither seemed worth distinguishing. In rare moments of stillness, when the camp slept and the fires burned low, a few found a fragile peace. They would sit outside their tents, gazing at the stars through a break in the clouds. The sky, indifferent and vast, offered no comfort, but it was clean. For a moment, the smell of blood faded, the noise receded, and they could imagine they were somewhere else. They were not knights or debtors or killers. They were simply men, breathing beneath the same stars that had watched them before all this began. But dawn always came, and with it, the weight of the world returned, the armour, the hunger, the orders barked from tents of silk, the illusion of glory, once bright as gold, dulled to iron. Each day became a repetition of endurance, and each night a quiet negotiation with despair. Beneath the shine of every blade was rust waiting to bloom. The poets never wrote of this, the filth, the fever, the aching bones. They chose instead the sound of trumpets, the glimmer of light upon steel. Yet here, in the mud and the hunger, was the truth of what they called chivalry, a fragile body inside a cage of metal, clinging to faith that had long since gone silent. Beneath every polished plate was a man praying. His armor wasn't stolen, not for pride, but for survival. And as they whispered those small, desperate prayers, something in them still reached for warmth, for touch, for something human. That quiet longing, barely spoken, half remembered, would carry them into the next chapter, where love and loneliness would meet beneath the same tattered banners. They were taught to die for honor, yet most died longing for a touch. In the songs and chronicles, knights loved only God and glory, their hearts sealed in iron, their desires purified by duty. But beneath the armor and the hymns, there pulsed a quieter truth, one that no priest or poet dared to write. The men who fought and bled for faith were still human, and humanity is never content with duty alone. Between battles, in stolen hours of silence, they reached for the small, forbidden warmths that made life bearable. Some found it in fleeting embraces, a washerwoman's smile in a camp, a brief encounter with a widow offering shelter, a promise whispered beneath a shroud of secrecy. For many, love was a rumor, not a right. They were told their bodies belonged to God, their hearts to the cause, and their desires to temptation. But loneliness has its own gravity, one that pulls even the devout from the safety of prayer. A single touch could remind them that they were still alive, that blood still moved beneath the bruises and scars. And so, they loved in silence, as if every heartbeat was a sin. There were letters, two-folded scraps of parchment carried through storms and sieges, written with trembling hands beside campfires. Words meant for wives, betrothed, or the women they had barely known. They wrote about nothing and everything, the weather, the ache of their backs, the way the sky looked before dawn. They promised to return, even when both writer and reader knew that promise was a lie. Some letters were buried with their authors, others found their way home years later, brittle and blood-stained, unreadable to those who waited too long. The lucky few who survived long enough to return home found that love had changed in their absence. The women they remembered were gone, or remarried, or buried by plague. The hearths they dreamed of were cold. Some tried to start again, but they were strangers in their own lives, too rough for gentleness, too haunted for peace. They carried the ghosts of the field into their homes, and their families learned to live beside them as one learns to live beside a storm. The church had little mercy for the tenderness of men. Love that was not sanctified by marriage or touched by lust was branded sin. The priests preached that carnal affection weakened the soul, that it distracted the warrior from divine purpose. But even the most pious could not pray away the ache of solitude. Men confessed to thoughts they could not control, dreams of women they had never met, memories that blurred the line between comfort and guilt. For their honesty, they were given penance, fasting, prayer, the lash. Faith demanded purity, yet offered no remedy for loneliness. There were other loves, quieter still, friendships born in the thick of war, stronger than any oath sworn before an altar. Two men sharing bread and fear, trusting one another more than they trusted God. They would not name it love, for to name it was to invite damnation. But in the stillness before dawn, when the camp slept and the world seemed distant, they would share a silence that felt holier than prayer. Some of those friendships ended on the field, one dying in the arms of the other, the word brother spoken like a prayer no church would ever bless. For many, affection survived only in memory. A lock of hair hidden beneath a breastplate, a ribbon tied around a wrist, a name carved quietly into the haft of a sword. These were their relics, not of saints, but of souls. They carried them through battles as talismans against fear, tokens of lives that still existed somewhere beyond the war. When death came, some were found clutching these tokens tighter than their weapons. History calls them soldiers, but their hearts were pilgrims. And yet, tenderness was dangerous. To care was to risk distraction. To grieve was to reveal weakness. Commanders forbade romance among their ranks, fearing it would soften discipline. The church echoed that fear, condemning desire as corruption. They told men that to love was to invite the devil, so the knights learned to hide it. They spoke little, touched less, and trained themselves to harden the very thing that made them human. They called it self-control, but it was only another kind of wound, invisible, but deep. There are fragments of forgotten confessions that tell of this private pain. One knight admitted to a priest that he had kissed a woman before battle and feared it had doomed his soul. Another confessed that he could not stop dreaming of his dead wife, her face appearing among the fallen. A third wrote in his journal, "They say I fight for heaven, but heaven has no scent. I fight for the memory of her hair." These voices were small, trembling, almost ashamed. But in their simplicity, they reveal the unbearable truth, that the war for the soul is not fought with swords, but with longing. The world around them offered no space for such vulnerability. The camps were places of endurance, not emotion. Even grief was rationed. When comrades died, the living said nothing. To mourn was to slow the march. Tears had no place in the machinery of obedience, so the heart learned to quiet itself, to store its ache in secret corners where no one could see. The knights carried their silence like armor, heavy and unyielding. In rare moments, when battle paused and the air grew still, that silence cracked. A glance shared across a campfire, a laugh too soft to be professional, the brush of hands when passing a cup. The smallest gestures became entire languages, expressions of life in a world that demanded death. Those moments vanished quickly, swallowed by duty, but they lingered in memory, glowing faintly against the darkness. They were taught to die for honor, but in truth, most died for far less a cause, a debt, a command. What they truly lived for, in the brief space between battles, was the chance to feel human, to love without fear, to remember what it was to be seen. And when that was denied, they learned to love in silence, in fragments, in ways the world would never notice. Perhaps this was the cruelest part of all, that tenderness, when it appeared, was treated as weakness. Men were praised for their brutality and punished for their compassion. The church taught them that purity required denial, that the heart was a battlefield to be conquered. But a heart subdued is not a heart redeemed. It is a heart turned to stone. As the centuries passed, their stories faded. The chronicles spoke of battles and banners, not of glances and goodbyes. The love that once lived in the shadows of war was forgotten, erased by those who feared its softness. But in the ruins of their armor, in the faint etchings of initials along a sword's edge, the truth endures. They were men who felt deeply and hid it well. And as this chapter closes, their longing remains not as sorrow, but as proof that even in the darkest ages, the need for love survived. Yet such emotions could not stay free for long. The same faith that had sanctified their battles would soon rise again to claim their hearts, twisting tenderness into sin and obedience into salvation. They didn't march for kings, they marched for salvation, paid in blood. That was the secret promise whispered from pulpit to throne, from monastery to battlefield. The sword was no longer just a weapon. It was a cross made of iron, forged not for justice, but for obedience. Every war blessed by the church became a pilgrimage of death. Those who fought were told that their blood was holy, that each life they took would carry them closer to heaven. It was a convenient kind of redemption, one that required no forgiveness, only loyalty. The church understood something the monarchs never fully grasped. Fear moves men faster than banners, and faith, true or false, binds them longer than gold. The papal decrees spread across Europe like wildfire, written in language so serene it disguised its cruelty. A knight who killed an infidel would be granted absolution. A crusader who died in battle would bypass purgatory and ascend straight to paradise. Murder became a sacrament, and war a form of worship. The clergy who wrote these words never saw the bodies their ink condemned. They sat in candlelight, composing salvation for others to die earning. The sermons were precise, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Fight, and you shall be cleansed. Die, and you shall be crowned. The knights listened, and they believed. What choice did they have? When a priest tells you God demands your blade, how could you say no? To doubt was heresy. To hesitate was sin. The church turned men's terror of damnation into a leash, leading them into the slaughter while calling it faith. In the shadow of these decrees, Europe convulsed. Peasants left their ploughs to join the Crusades, convinced that their poverty could be sanctified through suffering. Nobles mortgaged estates for armor and horses, dreaming of eternal reward. And the popes those masters of divine theatre promised all would be redeemed by blood. The very act of killing was washed clean by the killing itself. It was the perfect paradox. Sin transmuted into grace through repetition. The chronicles record processions of warriors kneeling before cathedrals, their swords laid across the altar. Priests walked among them, sprinkling holy water over blades already wet from other campaigns. The sound of Latin chants mixed with the clatter of metal and the trembling breath of men who feared they might not return. The church called it purification, but in truth, it was preparation not for salvation, but for servitude. The holy wars were not born from piety, they were born from profit and control. The papal states grew fat on the spoils of conquest, while the faithful carried the weight of their masters' ambitions. Even distant lands became commodities: Jerusalem, Antioch, Constantinople, each a spiritual brand to be owned, traded, or reclaimed. In this economy of souls, faith became a currency, and redemption a product. The priests spoke of sacrifice, but it was others who paid the price. Imagine a young knight, barely 20, kneeling before a bishop. He has never seen battle, never killed. The bishop presses a cross into his hand and tells him, "What you destroy, God will rebuild. What you kill, God will forgive." The knight nods, trembling. Later, on foreign soil, he drives his sword through a man who speaks a language he cannot understand. For a moment, he hesitates until he remembers the promise. Heaven, he thinks, is watching. But when the fighting ends, and he looks down at the body, something falters. The priest's words are still in his ear, but they no longer sound like truth. The tragedy of holy war is not merely that it kills, but that it sanctifies killing. Faith, once a refuge for the broken, became a banner for the cruel. Those who doubted were branded traitors to God. The church used salvation as both bait and blade, carving obedience into the hearts of men. A confession could erase murder, but questioning the reason for it could not be forgiven. The faithful were given permission to sin, as long as they sinned in the right direction. There are papal bulls still preserved, written in elegant Latin, their words immaculate, their meaning monstrous. They grant indulgence for those who bear arms in righteous struggle. They absolve the just slaying of the heretic. Each decree wrapped horror in holiness, making slaughter indistinguishable from service. These documents were read aloud in villages, often beside altars where candles flickered over carved wooden crucifixes. The irony was almost unbearable. The God who preached mercy had been conscripted as general. For the church, war was more than conquest. It was performance. The priests blessed the weapons, the banners, the corpses. They held mass before battle and requiem after victory. Even death was ritualized. The fallen knight laid beneath an embroidered shroud, his sins erased by decree. In the eyes of the clergy, his blood was ink in a holy contract. In the eyes of heaven, perhaps it was just another stain. Behind this theatre of righteousness, a deeper motive thrived. The wars kept men occupied, kept kingdoms indebted, and kept power centralized in Rome. The church that once feared the sword learned to wield it from afar, never dirtying its own hands. Each crusade strengthened its influence, reminding monarchs that salvation itself flowed through papal command. The shepherds had discovered the most efficient way to lead the flock through fear of eternal fire. But not all believed. Among the ranks were those who began to doubt. They saw too much children burned in churches, rivers running red, prayers drowned by screams. For them, the contradiction became unbearable. How could paradise be purchased with the suffering of the innocent? How could God demand so much cruelty to prove his love? These men confessed in secret, begging forgiveness not for disobedience, but for believing too much. Some abandoned the sword and fled to monasteries. Others lost their minds entirely, haunted by visions of paradise that looked too much like hell. The church called them weak. It called them lost. But perhaps they were simply the first to see through the veil, to recognize that divine warfare was the ultimate lie. The priests had promised heaven for the obedient, but what they delivered was silence. God's armies marched not toward grace, but toward emptiness. And yet, the illusion persisted. Even now, centuries later, the imagery of those crusades survives the shining cross, the valiant knight, the blessed blade. The myth endures because it comforts. It tells us that righteousness can justify anything, that belief can cleanse brutality. It is easier to imagine holiness in armor than to face the possibility that faith itself can be corrupted. They didn't march for kings, they marched for salvation, paid in blood. But salvation, as it turned out, was a debt no one could repay. The priests called them God's soldiers. History remembers them as executioners. Between the hymns and the screams, the truth vanished, replaced by ritual, repetition, and the perfume of incense masking the stench of death. And still, when the swords rusted and the fires dimmed, something lingered. A hunger for meaning amid destruction. That hunger would soon find new rituals, small, strange comforts men clung to in the shadows of faith. Charms, relics, whispered prayers to saints and spirits. The war for souls was far from over. It had simply changed its disguise. They wore crosses for God and amulets for the devil. In the flickering half-light of the medieval mind, faith and fear walked hand in hand. No knight rode to battle without a relic somewhere close to his heart. A splinter of the true cross, a saint's bone wrapped in silk, a strip of holy parchment sealed in wax. But beside these blessed tokens hung stranger things. A pebble from a witch's well, a carved talisman bearing the sign of a forgotten god, a charm whispered over by someone who never entered a church. To live through the chaos of war, one needed more than courage. One needed every kind of magic that could be found, even the kind that priests condemned. The church taught that God alone protected the faithful, but the world beyond the altar said otherwise. Lightning still struck chapels. Arrows still found the pious. Plague visited even those who prayed the loudest. And so men began to hedge their bets. A relic blessed by the bishop might rest beside a pagan charm, both pressed close against the chest beneath the armor. When death stalked the camps like a familiar guest, belief was not a system, it was a survival strategy. Faith was no longer pure, it was layered, tangled, contradictory. It was whatever might work when prayers alone had failed. In the trenches and tents, stories spread like contagion. Some claimed a saint's tooth had turned a blade aside. Others swore that a charm carved from a wolf's bone made its bearer invisible to death. The relic trade boomed. Monks and merchants travelled from abbey to battlefield, selling fragments of holiness by the handful, slivers of the Virgin's veil, threads from the robe of Christ, drops of blood that had somehow never dried. And when relics ran out, they made more. Bones from a common grave were sanctified with incense and scripture. The faithful never asked too many questions. Hope was too precious to risk with doubt. The priests condemned superstition from the pulpit, yet in secret they carried their own protections. Many wore medallions etched with forbidden symbols, ancient marks said to repel evil. They called them tokens of remembrance, though their geometry was older than scripture. Faith, for all its dogma, was porous. It absorbed what it feared, baptizing old gods in holy water and renaming them saints. In this strange fusion, Christianity became both shield and spell, a religion draped over the bones of older magic. To a knight, every object held power. A feather, a lock of hair, a coin marked with a lover's name. Before battle, men would touch these things as if touching life itself. They whispered charms not found in any holy book, quiet syllables of childhood prayers, old village blessings, fragments of forgotten tongues. The church called it blasphemy. But the church was far away, and the battlefield did not listen. In that mud-soaked world, no one cared who answered the prayer, only that someone did. There was an eerie beauty in these contradictions. A warrior might kneel at dawn to receive a priest's blessing, then hide a charm beneath his gauntlet before mounting his horse. He might whisper a Hail Mary, then touch a carved symbol of the moon. These were not acts of rebellion, they were acts of desperation. Faith and heresy became indistinguishable under the shadow of mortality. Every man's soul was a negotiation between what he feared and what he hoped was true. Not all relics were meant to protect. Some promised vengeance. Curses written on scraps of parchment were buried beneath enemy walls. Soldiers placed iron nails in the footprints of rival captains, believing it would weaken their resolve. Even bishops commissioned such charms, though they called them holy defences. It was said that faith without fear was useless, and so the faithful learned to fear correctly. The devil, after all, could be useful if kept at a distance. There are accounts of battlefields littered not only with weapons but with talismans scattered among the dead. Crosses, bones, stones, and symbols tangled in the mud. Faith and superstition united in ruin. Some relics were retrieved and resold. Others were buried with the fallen, returned to the earth as if holiness itself could decay. Perhaps it did. The Church declared these objects sacred, yet to those who wore them, they were far more personal, a last whisper of control in a world that belonged to chaos. The contradiction was not lost on the clergy. They tried to draw lines where none existed, issuing sermons against witchcraft while quietly blessing the charms that seemed to work. One bishop wrote that miracle and magic differ only by intention. It was a confession disguised as doctrine. The Church could not ban what it secretly needed. And so, superstition lived on beneath the vestments, hidden but never absent. In monasteries, relics became the lifeblood of commerce. Pilgrims paid fortunes for a glimpse of a saint's finger or a vial of tears. Relics travelled like ambassadors, carried across kingdoms under armed guard. They were paraded through towns to end plagues, blessed soldiers before sieges, and calmed riots with their silent promise of divine proximity. Yet no one could say with certainty whose bones they truly were. Faith required belief, and belief required ignorance. The less one knew, the stronger the miracle. Some soldiers began to believe that relics themselves possessed moods, that bones grew restless if neglected, that holy dust lost its power when carried by a sinner. They treated them like living companions, feeding them drops of wine, whispering apologies for doubt. The line between devotion and delusion blurred until even priests could not tell where one ended and the other began. The battlefield was a church without walls, its altar made of mud and terror, its sacraments stolen from both heaven and earth. There was comfort in the illusion. To believe that a fragment of wood could turn aside a spear, or that a saint's name could still the bleeding, was to believe that death was negotiable. Hope was a form of resistance and superstition, its disguise. The relics did not save them, but they kept them sane. In the darkness, belief was the only light left burning. They wore crosses for God and amulets for the devil. Between the two, they survived or thought they did. Faith had become armour not against sin, but against despair. And while priests condemned the mixing of sacred and profane, they could not undo what desperation had already forged. The soul of the medieval world was not pure white or black. It was grey, glimmering, and alive with contradictions. Yet among all these relics and charms, a question began to fester, quietly, dangerously. If holy objects could lie, and if forbidden charms could protect, what did that say about truth itself? What if the difference between God and the devil was only who told the story? Those who dared to ask such questions would soon find themselves branded as heretics. And while the faithful clung to their charms, others began to strip them away, searching not for magic, but for meaning. The age of blind belief was trembling, about to fracture. And in the cracks, something new and dangerous began to breathe. They fought for God, then dared to ask if he was ever there. For centuries, the Church told them that faith was a shield, that obedience was salvation, and that every death in his name was holy. But some began to see the cracks. Between prayers and bloodshed, between sermons and screams, a few knights started to wonder if heaven had been silent all along. They were not heretics by intention, only men whose faith had been tested too far, stretched to the breaking point. In their exhaustion they found clarity, in their doubt something like truth. These were not scholars or priests, but soldiers, men of the sword who had seen too much to believe in the perfection of those who commanded them. They had watched bishops bless wars for gold, popes trade forgiveness for favours, and priests absolve cruelty with a wave of the hand. They had carried relics that failed to save, recited prayers that no longer sounded holy, and in the stillness after battle, they asked questions that no one wanted to hear. If God was justice, why did the wicked thrive? If he was mercy, why did his servants demand so much blood? And if the Church spoke for him, why did he always sound like a man? One knight, writing in secret, confessed that he no longer prayed before battle. The sky, he wrote, was empty when I called, yet my blade still struck true. Perhaps that was the only miracle. Another described a vision of paradise that vanished when the screams of the dying reached his ears. He wondered if heaven had ever been more than a story told to make death tolerable. These fragments, hidden in letters and journals, survived only by accident, their authors burned, their words buried in archives too obscure for censors to find. They were the whispers of a faith unraveling. The church taught that doubt was the devil's seed, but for these men, it felt like awakening. They began to see holiness not in temples or decrees, but in silence, in the way light moved across an open field after slaughter. Some wrote that God had withdrawn from men entirely, not in anger, but in sorrow. He left, one wrote, because we would not stop using his name to kill. It was not blasphemy that frightened the church, it was honesty. To say aloud that God might not approve of his own wars was to strip power from every altar in Europe. Among the Crusaders, there were those who refused to take communion before battle, claiming it was hypocrisy to eat the body of peace before committing murder. Others stopped wearing the cross altogether, saying they could no longer tell whether it was a symbol of redemption or control. They did not speak these thoughts publicly. Of course, confession had become dangerous. The same priests who once blessed them now listened for any word that might hint at disobedience. Faith had become surveillance. There are stories, mostly whispered in monasteries, of knights who simply walked away. They vanished into the hills, leaving their armor behind like shed skin. Some joined wandering sects that rejected the church's wealth, preaching that salvation could not be bought. Others lived alone, building shrines to no one, lighting candles for a god they no longer trusted but could not quite abandon. They prayed, not for forgiveness, but for understanding. The villagers called them mad. The bishops called them cursed. But perhaps they were the only ones still sane. One such figure, known only through fragments of testimony, was a knight named Arnaud de Vere. He had fought in 2 crusades, seen cities burn, and heard priests declare each victory a miracle. But when his brother was executed for refusing to massacre prisoners, Arnaud's faith collapsed. He began writing at night, copying passages from scripture, and adding questions beside them in the margins. If God is love, why must we prove it with hate? He was arrested by inquisitors within a year. The church destroyed his writings, but a single page survived, preserved by a monk who could not bear to see it burn. In that page, Arnaud wrote of a dream. In it, he stood in a battlefield of bones, and above him the sky was clear, endless, and silent. He called out to heaven and heard nothing, but when he placed his ear to the earth, he heard a heartbeat. Perhaps, he wrote, God fell long ago, and we have been praying to the echo ever since. Such words were enough to damn him. He was tried in secret, convicted of heresy, and executed before dawn. The records list him as unrepentant. Yet the tone of his writings suggests not rebellion, but heartbreak. He was not defying God, he was grieving him. Not all doubters were so overt. Many buried their questions in ritual, performing the motions of faith while feeling nothing inside. One chronicler described knights kneeling in prayer before battle as men who pretend to sleep so that dreams may still visit them. Their obedience became theatre gestures of devotion offered to silence. The church, desperate to preserve control, began to sense this hollowness, and so it doubled down. More indulgences, more threats, more crusades. Nothing silences doubt like noise. But the silence kept growing. The battlefield was no longer the only place of death. Belief itself was beginning to decay. The knights who questioned heaven did not seek to destroy faith, they sought to make it honest. They wanted a God who could answer, not a hierarchy that spoke for him. They were soldiers, not theologians, yet they grasped what centuries of scholars could not, that truth and obedience were never the same thing. Their rebellion was quiet, invisible, and therefore unstoppable. Each question whispered in confession, each prayer left unfinished, each relic left untouched was a small act of resistance. Together, they formed a chorus too low for the church to hear, but too deep for it to erase. When inquisitors came, they found few books and fewer confessions. Doubt does not burn like parchment. It lingers, invisible in the air, waiting to be breathed by the next generation. The church labelled them heretics, though few ever preached. They simply stopped pretending. In doing so, they committed the most unforgivable sin. They withdrew their belief from the machine that fed on it. Power cannot survive without faith to sustain it. And so these men were hunted not for denying God, but for refusing to believe in his handlers. They fought for God, then dared to ask if he was ever there. Their stories end in silence, burned at stakes, erased from records, lost to dust. But the questions they asked never truly died. They linger like ghosts in old cathedrals, echoing behind the stained glass and incense. Sometimes, When the wind moves through ruined chapels, it sounds almost like a voice asking, "Are you still listening?" Soon, that silence would be broken. The church, threatened by these murmurs of awakening, would unleash its fury in full inquisitions, purges, and the rewriting of history itself. The age of quiet rebellion was ending. The age of erasure was about to begin. The truest warriors were never remembered, only erased. Their words did not echo through cathedrals or survive in gilded chronicles. They vanished in the hiss of parchment meeting flame, in the hollow silence left after confession turned to accusation. The age that had once promised salvation now hunted those who asked what salvation meant. And the church, frightened by its own reflection, built pyres high enough to reach the sky. It began quietly, one monk disappearing from his scriptorium, a scholar's notes found missing from his cell, a knight recalled to Rome for spiritual evaluation. Then, as whispers grew, the purges began official, righteous, merciless. The Inquisition was not a storm, it was a suffocation. It did not need to rage to destroy. It only needed time. Priests in black robes moved from village to village, bearing seals of authority and lists of names. They called it cleansing. They said they were saving souls. But what they burned were questions. The fires were methodical. They began with books, fragile things, easily consumed. Monasteries became furnaces of knowledge. Works of philosophy, letters, journals, even psalters with marginal notes too curious for comfort all fed to the flames. The air filled with the smell of ink and leather, a strange perfume of wisdom dying. In some towns, the people gathered to watch, not out of malice, but fear. To look away was to appear complicit. And so they stared, whispering prayers as pages curled into smoke, their faith rising and vanishing at the same time. One chronicler described how the heat of those bonfires could be felt streets away, how the ashes floated down like black snow, settling on rooftops and faces alike. It was as though heaven itself were falling, he wrote. He was executed a week later. The record of his name survived only in the indictment that condemned him. The Inquisition understood that memory was dangerous. The simplest way to control it was to rewrite it. The knights who had once questioned heaven were among the first to die. Their armour, once symbols of faith, now marked them as hypocrites, soldiers of God turned against his priests. They were summoned under false pretenses: penance, inquiry, absolution. Few returned. Torture rooms became confessionals where pain replaced prayer. Those who refused to recant were burned as examples. Those who did were broken long before forgiveness arrived. Their names were erased from rolls, their families disowned, their graves unmarked. Only rumour remembered them, and even rumour grew cautious. It was not only men who perished, but meaning itself. The Church declared that all knowledge not sanctioned by doctrine was heresy. The libraries that survived were censored, their margins scraped clean, their forbidden words replaced with silence. Illuminated manuscripts were defaced saints' faces painted over where philosophers once stood. The great scriptoria that had once preserved civilization became factories of obedience. The quills no longer wrote to remember, they wrote to erase. The cruelty was not loud, it was patient. The Inquisition understood the rhythm of fear, how slowly it seeps, how deeply it roots. People began to censor themselves, burning their own books before the priests arrived. Families destroyed letters, diaries, even prayers that might be misunderstood. Language itself became dangerous. Words were weighed before being spoken, their meanings inspected like coins for false marks. And in that caution, thought began to shrink. The fire spread without flame. One knight's widow kept his writings hidden beneath the floorboards of her cottage. They were small things, confessions, poems, fragments of doubt. Each night she read them by candlelight, whispering his words as if to keep his spirit alive. When the inquisitors came, she refused to speak. They burned her house with the writings inside. The chroniclers noted the incident only as a purification of heretical residue. That phrase, cold and perfect, survived in an official record. The human lives did not. In towns and monasteries, witnesses began to believe that perhaps those who questioned truly were cursed. The logic of terror became faith itself. The priests spoke of cleansing darkness, of bringing light to the world. And so they lit their torches, never seeing that light and destruction had become the same thing. The fires were beautiful. In a way, a choreography of ruin. Gold leaf melted into streams, ink bled like veins, voices became smoke, and as the last pages burned, the silence felt holy. The greatest irony of the age was that the Inquisition succeeded not because it destroyed truth, but because it replaced it with comfort. It offered certainty where doubt had once lived. People were tired of war, of famine, of questions without answers. To surrender to authority was easier than to think. The Church promised peace, and the price was memory. Few refused. Those who did were already ashes. There are fragments that survived, pieces of parchment hidden in walls, notes smuggled across borders, letters buried in graves. They speak in broken Latin, half-lost French, trembling ink. One reads, "They fear what cannot die, the thought that God may be watching them, not us." Another, written by an anonymous monk, says simply, "The silence is heavier than fire." These scraps, fragile as dried leaves, are all that remain of an age that devoured itself in the name of purity. When the flames finally subsided, Europe was quieter. The smoke rose high enough to stain the clouds. Cathedrals stood untouched, their bells still ringing, but the voices that had once filled them were gone. The knights, the scholars, the wandering preachers all reduced to myth or warning. The Church proclaimed victory, calling it the restoration of order. But beneath the calm, something vital had died. The world no longer dreamed aloud. And yet, even silence has memory. In the centuries that followed, rumours persisted of hidden libraries sealed behind abbey walls, of charred manuscripts copied in secret by trembling hands. Some claimed that fragments of the forbidden text survived disguised as psalms, their blasphemies concealed in acrostic lines. The Inquisition could burn the words, but not the hunger that birthed them. The questions smouldered beneath the ashes, waiting for air. The truest warriors were never remembered, only erased. Their courage left no monuments, no statues in squares, no names on marble. But the absence they left behind became its own kind of monument, an invisible wound in history. It is in that emptiness that truth still whispers, faint but unextinguished. For every burned book, there is someone who remembers the scent of its smoke. For every silenced voice, there is another who hears the echo in their dreams. And as the ashes settled, the world that had once worshipped knights and banners began to decay. The armour rusted, the castles crumbled, and the light of faith dimmed to embers. What replaced it was not peace, but weariness, the slow fading of an age that had believed too much. The Inquisition's fire had purified nothing. It had only revealed the truth of its own fear. The knights were gone, the scholars silenced, but the questions remained glowing faintly beneath the ruins, like coals beneath cold ash. And from that dying light, a new darkness began to grow, not of fire, but of forgetting. When the guns spoke, the age of honour died in silence. The first echoes were distant, almost unremarkable, the sharp crack of a new invention cutting through the rhythm of steel. Few noticed at first. A single puff of smoke on a far hill, a sound that seemed too small to matter. But in that brief, thunderous breath, the old world began to unravel. The clash of swords that had sung for centuries fell quiet. The age of the knight of banners, vows, and shining armour was ending, not with a roar, but with a sigh. The transformation came slowly, like rot beneath paint. At first, knights laughed at gunpowder, calling it coward's fire. They saw no honour in killing from afar. A true warrior, they said, looked his enemy in the eye. Yet even they could not argue with its efficiency. Armour that once deflected arrows crumpled before lead. Castles that had withstood sieges for decades surrendered in days. The world had discovered a new alchemy, not of gold or immortality, but of destruction. The code of chivalry, built on courage, proximity, and ritual, could not survive a weapon that needed neither. In fields where horses once charged, cannons now stood heavy, patient beasts of iron. Smoke rolled across the plains, turning day to twilight. Men no longer fought face to face. They vanished into clouds of gunfire, reduced to shadows in their own war. The knight's sword, once a symbol of divine favour, became obsolete. A relic, polished more for ceremony than survival. Some clung to their armour, riding into battle as if defiance itself could deflect a bullet. They died quickly, their ideals shattered as easily as their breastplates. The Church tried to sanctify this new warfare. to find God in the thunder of guns as it once had in the clash of blades. But there was no poetry in powder, no room for faith in the mechanical. The holy blessing of swords rang hollow when muskets lined the pews. The priests still raised their hands in benediction, but the smoke rose faster than their prayers. Even heaven, it seemed, could not keep up with progress. The knightly orders, once proud and unshakable, began to decay from within. Without wars of faith to fight, they turned inward, their castles half empty, their halls echoing with the ghosts of purpose. Many sold their lands, trading steel for silk, their heritage for survival. Those who refused became wanderers, relics of a vanished creed. They wandered through villages that no longer bowed, through cities where merchants held more power than kings. The people still admired their stories, but only as entertainment. The night became a tale told to children, a symbol of something noble that never quite was. In the silence of abandoned armories, rust began its slow hymn. The chainmail that had once gleamed under sunlight dulled to brown, flaking into dust. Swords hung forgotten on stone walls, their edges softened by time. Helmets filled with rainwater, shields cracked beneath ivy. The relics of valor turned to debris. It was as if the land itself was reclaiming what it had once lent to human pride, taking back the iron, the stone, the illusion of invincibility. For the few who lived long enough to witness the change, it was a kind of mourning. Old knights watched the rise of the new world with hollow eyes. They attended parades where musketeers marched beneath banners that once bore their family crests. They saw their own sons abandon the sword for the ledger, the field for the factory. Chivalry, once the heartbeat of civilization, had become an artifact embalmed in ceremony, divorced from life. The code that once defined manhood now belonged to poets, not warriors. There is a quiet tragedy in how ideals die, not through betrayal, but through irrelevance. The world no longer needed honor when precision could do the work of bravery. Gunpowder made all men equal, noble and peasant, knight and thief, because it made them all equally fragile. Death no longer cared for lineage. A single spark could erase centuries of bloodlines. The battlefield had become democratic in the cruelest possible way. Yet even as the iron rusted, nostalgia began to bloom. The same people who had replaced knights with guns began to miss them. Artists painted gallant figures on horseback. Poets sang of lost valor. The more distant the memory became, the more perfect it seemed. Chivalry, stripped of its cruelty, returned as myth purified by the distance of time. The knights who once died in mud were resurrected in marble, their sins forgotten, their flaws romanticized. What was brutal became beautiful. What was complex became simple. The world mourned an age it had never truly understood. For the Church, this transformation was convenient. It could canonize what it could no longer control. The knight became a symbol of divine obedience, a model of sacrifice rather than rebellion. Statues rose where pyres had burned. History was rewritten in gold leaf, its ink free of blood. And so, even in death, the warriors served not as soldiers of God, but as decorations in his house. Their silence became useful again. But some remnants of truth remained in the letters of dying men, in the journals of disillusioned nobles, in the rusted relics dug from forgotten fields. These remnants whispered a quieter story, that progress does not destroy belief. It merely buries it beneath new noise. The world had traded one illusion for another. The sword was gone, but the hunger for righteousness, for power disguised as virtue, endured. Gunpowder was only the next chapter in the same old book, one written in ash instead of ink. When iron turned to dust, wrote one nameless chronicler, so did the hearts of men. His words, faint and nearly lost, capture what the poets missed. That every age believes itself wise for killing what came before, only to worship its corpse later. The knight's death was not a failure of courage, but of memory. The ideals that once defined an era dissolved into nostalgia, and nostalgia, as ever, was the most seductive lie of all. When the guns spoke, the age of honor died in silence. Yet in that silence, something lingered, a longing, a shadow, the faint echo of hoofbeats fading into mist. For all its cruelty, the age of the sword had given men a story to believe in, and when that story ended, they searched for another to replace it. The myths of knighthood would soon be reborn, polished and purified, their edges dulled for comfort. The world had killed the knight, but it was not yet ready to let him go. History didn't remember them. It reinvented them. The knights who had once bled in the mud, who died nameless in the service of power and faith, were reborn in ink and song. Their rusted armor became silver again, their trembling prayers became oaths of courage, and their contradictions were smoothed into perfection. The age that had forgotten them decided it missed them after all, but not as they were. It wanted their ghosts, not their truth. It wanted beauty, not blood. It began with poets. In candlelit courts, they sang of chivalry, as if it had never ended. They wrote of knights who never grew hungry, who never sinned, whose swords gleamed with justice rather than despair. The real men had been buried by time, but their shadows became useful. A world now ruled by merchants and muskets longed for the simplicity of honor, an illusion that could make the chaos of modernity feel romantic. The poets gave them that illusion. With every verse, the past became softer, brighter, safer. The dirt was washed away with rhyme. Rulers quickly understood the value of this nostalgia. A dead knight could not rebel, could not question, could not contradict the story told in his name. Monarchs began sponsoring works of history that praised the old codes of loyalty and obedience. The knight was reimagined as the perfect subject, brave, pious, and eternally loyal to the crown. His flaws, greed, cruelty, disillusion were erased, replaced by polished virtues. In rewriting the knight, rulers rewrote the idea of duty itself. The myth became propaganda not for faith this time, but for authority. The church, too, found comfort in the illusion. After centuries of blood and heresy, it needed symbols that could redeem its image, so it sanctified the very figures it had once condemned. The burned heretics became martyrs. The disillusioned warriors were recast as examples of divine discipline. Cathedrals began displaying relics said to belong to holy knights who had died defending the faith. The irony was almost sublime. The same institution that had erased their voices now sold their silence as virtue. In the new legend, no one doubted, no one despaired, no one asked questions that could burn a world down. Artists followed. Paintings filled the halls of kings and nobles, depicting gallant warriors kneeling before serene maidens or shining crosses. The armor gleamed impossibly bright. The faces were serene, untouched by fear. No mud, no rot, no trembling hands. Only nobility frozen in perfection. The reality of war, the filth, the hunger, the smell of death was painted out, replaced by gold leaf and heroic poses. The knight was no longer a man. He was a mirror in which a weary civilization could admire its own reflection. It was not deceit, at least not consciously. It was longing, the human instinct to polish memory until it shines. People needed to believe that the past had meaning, that their ancestors were noble rather than desperate. It was easier to build monuments than to confront decay, and so the stories multiplied. Every village claimed a hero, every dynasty a champion, every battlefield a miracle. The further the truth receded, the more sacred the myth became. But beneath this glittering revival, something uncanny stirred. Those who read deeply, scholars, chroniclers, wandering priests, sensed the absence beneath the beauty. They noticed the gaps in records, the contradictions smoothed over, the deliberate silences. A few dared to write what they suspected, that the legends were lies, and that the lies were necessary. "We have built a temple to what we destroyed," wrote one monk in the margins of a manuscript, "and we call it remembrance." His words were crossed out in later editions. The myth spread far beyond art and scripture. It seeped into language itself. Knightly came to mean noble, virtuous, pure. Children were taught that chivalry was the soul of civilization, not its mask. The story was repeated so often it became indistinguishable from truth. Every age that followed borrowed the illusion, painting its own soldiers, its own leaders, its own wars in the colours of glory. The knights lived on, not as people, but as symbols that excused the same mistakes. The myth of purity justified impurity. The myth of honour justified power. There is something almost tender in how humanity preserves its illusions. We do not simply lie to deceive, we lie to endure. The myth of the knight was not just a rewriting of history, it was a kind of prayer. A wish that beneath all the horror, some fragment of goodness had existed. That in the long night of cruelty and faith, there had been light. The poets gave that light shape. The rulers gave it purpose. And we, centuries later, inherited it as truth. The printing press, that great engine of knowledge, carried the myth further than any sword ever could. Ballads of honor flooded Europe, rewritten and romanticized with each generation. The knight became universal, a symbol of how people wanted to believe they once were. Even as wars grew colder and more mechanical, the image of the chivalric hero persisted, whispering that valor and virtue could still survive in a world that no longer required them. The myth outlived its makers. And so, the knight returned not to battlefields, but to books. His ghost rode through stories and paintings, through classrooms and cathedrals. He became what he had always been meant to be, an idea too convenient to die. The same societies that had discarded him now held him up as proof of lost greatness. They wept for what they themselves had destroyed, calling the destruction progress and the regret tradition. Yet in the quiet corners of archives, the truth remains. Letters stained with mud, confessions half-burned, chronicles that speak of hunger instead of honor. The voices of real men, trembling with doubt and fatigue. They exist in fragments, too fragile for legend, too human for myth. Their survival is accidental, their meaning profound. They remind us that history is not made of heroes but of people who suffered under the weight of other people's stories. History didn't remember them, it reinvented them. The knight who once bled became a symbol of perfection. The soldier who doubted became the saint of obedience. The truth became a costume so finely tailored that even time could not see the seams. Yet the seams are there, beneath the gold and the marble, beneath the prayers and the paintings. If one looks closely enough, one can still glimpse the cracks, the faint outline of the man behind the myth. And that is where this story now turns, to us, because the lies they told to comfort themselves did not end with them. We still live among their echoes in our monuments, our language, our ideas of virtue. The myth of purity still shapes our wars, our faiths, our politics, our love. We still long for knights, even as we inherit their ghosts. And just as they once looked backward to find meaning, so do we. The legend endures, not because it was true, but because we need it to be. The age of chivalry died when gunpowder spoke, but its dream survived, rewritten, retold, and reborn in every era that fears its own reflection. What began as a lie became a lineage, passed down not through blood, but through belief. The world had buried the knight, but it could not bury the story. And that story, polished and repainted, would soon awaken again, not in armor or in prayer, but in the myths that still shape who we think we are. The myth never died, it just learned to sell better. What once was sung by poets and sanctified by priests is now projected on screens, rendered in pixels, and whispered through speakers in darkened rooms. The knight, long buried beneath centuries of rust and truth, has been resurrected again, shinier than ever, stripped of his sins, reborn as spectacle. We no longer kneel before his altar, we subscribe to it. The myth has not faded, it has adapted. In this new age, the sword has been replaced by the camera. Armor gleams under studio light instead of sunlight. Every frame, every soundtrack, every perfect pause between explosions serves the same ancient purpose to make violence feel noble. The knight's code has been digitized, flattened, and franchised. Where once the church sold absolution, the modern world sells catharsis. Both promise the same thing, that cruelty, when performed for the right reasons, is still sacred. Cinema, perhaps more than any cathedral, has become the sanctuary of the myth. We cheer for warriors who fight for honor, freedom, justice, words that shimmer like relics, untouchable and vague. We watch as heroes kill cleanly, suffer beautifully, and die meaningfully. Every image is carefully composed to erase the ugliness that truth once revealed. No filth, no fever, no trembling hands. Only slow-motion glory, the choreography of righteousness. The modern audience consumes redemption as entertainment, the way their ancestors once consumed indulgences. The moral price is hidden behind the cut to black. Video games have carried the myth further still. They make the player the knight immortal, justified, endlessly rewarded for conquest. Each quest repeats the same logic that once filled crusades. Kill to save, destroy to restore order, believe that the enemy deserves their fate. The code of chivalry has become a control scheme, simple and satisfying. And when the screen goes dark, the illusion persists, the feeling of virtue without the burden of consequence. In pixels and polygons, the old faith thrives. Books, too, keep the flame alive, dressed now in fantasy instead of scripture. Dragons and dark lords replace infidels and heretics, but the structure remains identical. A chosen hero, a divine mission, a world divided between the righteous and the damned. Readers call it escapism, but it is really memory, the subconscious recall of an old pattern. The need for a savior, the promise of purity through struggle. The medieval dream, polished and reset, still whispers that to fight is to be good, and to question the fight is to betray it. The myth survives because it flatters us. It tells us that our instincts for conquest, for dominance, for righteousness, are not flaws but virtues. It gives violence a moral costume and calls it destiny. We believe it not because it's convincing, but because it's comforting. The knight is the part of us that wants to believe we can be brutal and still be pure. He makes our contradictions poetic. He lets us call cruelty courage and vengeance justice. Advertising learned this language long ago. Cars, watches, colognes, all sold with the same imagery once used to glorify battle. Steel, speed, mastery, control. Be the hero, the billboards say. Conquer the day. Every slogan is a miniature crusade. Every product a relic of modern faith. The belief that we are still noble warriors, even when our wars are fought in traffic and offices. The armour is metaphorical now, but the desire behind it remains unchanged. The myth thrives not because we forget history, but because we prefer its reflection. We know, somewhere in the quiet corners of our awareness, that real knights were men of flesh and error. Yet the image, the shining saviour, the tragic hero, is irresistible. The camera and the console give us control over what reality once denied. The power to rewrite defeat as destiny. In fiction, we are no longer peasants or witnesses. We are conquerors, absolved and applauded. The irony is that this myth now belongs to everyone. What was once the privilege of noble birth has become universal fantasy. Anyone can wear the armour now on a screen, in a story, behind a username. The democratization of illusion feels like justice, but it is only a more efficient dream. The myths we consume us in return. We perform their rituals, the clicks, the cheers, the purchases, without realizing they are liturgies. The church no longer needs to preach. The market does it better. And yet, behind the spectacle, the same silence remains. The stories rarely ask what happens after the battle, or what it costs to believe in glory. The heroes do not age, do not question, do not carry the ghosts of those they've slain. Like the knights before them, they exist in a suspended eternity, a loop of triumph and sacrifice that never resolves. It is the perfect illusion, redemption without memory, purpose without consequence. The modern knight lives forever, because he never truly lives at all. The storytellers, of course, know what they are doing. They understand the hunger that drives the myth, the need to feel small but significant, powerless yet righteous. The audience does not want truth. It wants recognition. To see in the hero's reflection a version of themselves untainted by hesitation. The old priests called it faith. The new ones call it fandom. Both feed on devotion, and both reward belief with belonging. Still, sometimes the illusion flickers. A film lingers too long on a dying soldier's face. A game offers a choice that feels wrong. A book ends not in triumph, but in ambiguity. In those moments, the myth trembles, and for a heartbeat, we see the machinery behind it, the centuries of manipulation, the pattern repeating itself in brighter colours. But the revelation passes, the next trailer drops, the next saga begins, and the dream restores itself, smoother than before. The myth adapts faster than doubt. The knight in the screen is no longer a man, nor even a symbol of morality. He is an interface, a medium through which power tells stories about itself. The form changes, but the function remains, to make obedience feel meaningful, to make violence beautiful, to make belief profitable. Every shot, every story, every sound echoes the same ancient prayer, fight and you shall be forgiven. The myth never died. It just learned to sell better. It learned to move faster, to look sharper, to smile while it kills. And we, who watch and listen, become its newest believers. We wear its symbols on t-shirts, chant its lines in theatres, and call it culture. But beneath the noise and colour, the story remains unchanged. The knight rides on, now in pixels and profits, his shadow stretched across every screen. Soon, the story will turn inward toward us, the dreamers who keep the myth alive. Because beneath every tale of heroism lies a question we never stop asking. Why do we need to believe in warriors at all? And in that question, that small, forbidden doubt, begins the next revelation. Not about them, but about us. We still worship the sword, not because it saved us, but because we fear its truth. Somewhere deep within the human spirit lies a craving for heroes, for stories that tell us we are more than fragile beings drifting toward death. We build myths not to remember history, but to survive it. The knight, the warrior, the savior, these are the masks we wear to hide what frightens us most, our own weakness, our own hunger for meaning in a world that often feels indifferent. The myth endures because it heals, or at least pretends to. It takes chaos and carves it into purpose. It gives names to suffering, turning accidents into destiny. When we tell ourselves stories of noble battles and righteous causes, we soften the edges of history's cruelty. The blood becomes symbolic, the victims sanctified, the victors redeemed. The sword gleams again, not as a weapon but as an idea, sharp, clean, uncorrupted by flesh. It is easier to believe in symbols than to face the mess of truth. Every age, no matter how modern, rediscovers the knight within itself. We may no longer wear armor, but we still seek the same absolution. We call our conquests progress, our competitions struggle, our ambitions duty. The language shifts, but the hunger remains. We need our illusions of courage because they let us disguise our fear. Beneath every anthem of victory hides the trembling truth. We are terrified of insignificance. To imagine ourselves as warriors, even metaphorically, is to imagine that our pain matters, that we are fighting for something larger than ourselves. The myth comforts because it reverses the roles. In the old stories, death is not the end, but the validation of virtue. The hero dies beautifully, meaningfully, leaving behind a legacy that redeems the suffering. But real death, unceremonious, sudden, unjust, offers no such grace. It is random, humiliating, ordinary. The myth transforms this inevitability into a stage where we may choose how we fall. It gives us the illusion of control over what cannot be controlled. And so we cling to it, even when it lies. There is also guilt beneath the worship. We glorify violence to hide our complicity in it. The myth tells us that war was necessary, that cruelty served a higher good. It absolves not only the killers but the spectators, those who watched, who benefited, who turned away. It wraps history in justification so that we can inherit its spoils without shame. To question the myth would be to admit that we built our civilizations on suffering. Easier then to keep polishing the sword and calling it light. The myth becomes medicine for the soul, not a cure, but an anesthetic. It numbs us against despair. It whispers that our flaws are virtues in disguise, that our destruction is divine design. When the world feels meaningless, the myth gives it a script. Every pain becomes a test, every failure a lesson, every loss a sacrifice. Even in our private lives, we repeat this pattern. We call endurance heroism, obsession passion, and survival destiny. We dress our wounds in poetry so they do not look like fear. But myths, like medicines, have side effects. The same stories that comfort us also chain us. We begin to believe that strength must look like domination, that compassion is weakness, that redemption requires blood. We turn our fears into ideals, and our ideals into prisons. The knight who once defended life becomes the emblem of conquest. The sword we revere becomes the very thing that keeps us from healing. Humanity keeps circling the same story, mistaking its reflection for revelation. Why, then? Can we not let it go? Perhaps because the myth is not only about war, it is about belonging. To believe in heroes is to believe we are part of a larger pattern, that our lives connect to something eternal. Without that belief, existence feels unbearable in its smallness. We need the myth like a heartbeat, even when it deceives us. It promises that courage still matters, that sacrifice still redeems, that meaning can still be found in the ruins. Without such promises, we fear we would collapse into silence. And yet, if we look closely, the myth does contain a hidden truth, one the poets and priests never meant to teach. Beneath the armor and the prayers, beneath the violence and the lies, there has always been something fragile and human, endurance. The true strength of those long-dead warriors was not their skill with the sword, but their persistence in the face of despair. Even in the mud, even in the madness, they kept moving forward. That endurance, not the myth of honor, but the quiet refusal to surrender, is what deserves to survive. Perhaps this is the lesson the myth was trying to tell all along, disguised by centuries of spectacle. The sword was never the answer, it was only the mirror. It reflected our longing to rise above fear, our desperate need to believe that we could face death without trembling. If we strip away the illusion, what remains is not glory but vulnerability, the simple courage to exist, to care, to continue. That is the real heroism the myths accidentally preserve. We still worship the sword because it stands where language fails. It is the shape we give to awe, to terror, to the parts of ourselves that crave both safety and danger. But the time has come to look past it, to see not the weapon, but the hand that holds it, the heart that trembles beneath it. The myth owns us only as long as we mistake its symbol for salvation. Imagine, then, what would happen if we let the myth rest. If we stopped polishing the old stories and began listening to the silences between them. We might find that compassion was always the truth, buried beneath the noise, that endurance, not conquest, was what made humanity worthy of remembrance. The knight's tragedy was not that he died for an illusion, but that he never realized he didn't need to. The sword will always glimmer in our imagination. It is too old, too sacred, too deeply woven into our language to vanish. But perhaps, one day, we will stop worshipping its edge and start understanding its weight. To hold the sword without using it, to carry its history without repeating it, that might be the final act of courage, the one the myths never wrote. We still worship the sword, not because it saved us, but because it reminds us of what we are still trying to become. And until we learn to live without it, we will keep telling the same stories, mistaking the reflection for the source. But somewhere beneath the noise of legend, beneath the hum of screens and sermons, the real lesson waits quiet, patient, and human. Compassion endures. And endurance, at last, is the only truth that never needed a myth. Their greatest strength wasn't how they fought, it was how they forgave. Beneath the ruins of legend and the ashes of holy war, fragments of a quieter truth still breathe. In forgotten manuscripts, in songs sung softly by villagers who never learned to write, there lingers a different kind of memory. One not of conquest, but of endurance. The knights who left no statues, no chronicles, no bloodlines of power, carried within them a wisdom that survived precisely because it was humble. They were not the heroes history chose to remember, but perhaps they were the only ones who learned what heroism really meant. In old ballads and pilgrim journals, the narrator finds traces of this gentler creed. A soldier's letter home, found centuries later in the ruins of a monastery, speaks not of triumph but of regret, of prayers whispered for enemies he could no longer name. "I saw their faces," he wrote, "and they looked like ours." The ink is faint, the parchment torn, but his words shine through the damage like veins of gold in stone. Such men learned too late that faith could wound, and that mercy, not victory, was the truest form of courage. They carried that knowledge silently, knowing it would never be sung. The songs that survived from those times are not hymns of battle, but laments. They tell of nights spent tending the wounded, of enemies buried side by side, of the strange tenderness that flickered between moments of horror. The melodies are soft, circular, meant to be sung while working, while rocking a child to sleep, reminders that even in ages of brutality, kindness did not vanish. It simply went underground, like roots in winter. The church may have preached salvation through suffering, but these songs offered something else: salvation through understanding. In one surviving verse from the 14th century, an anonymous soldier sings of washing the blood from another man's hands, not his own. He wept. The line reads, "And I held him until dawn." No chronicler recorded such acts. No scribe gilded those moments in gold leaf. But they existed, quiet rebellions against the machinery of cruelty. To forgive, to show mercy, to endure without hatred, these were the true miracles of that age. Too ordinary to be canonized, too profound to be forgotten completely. The deeper the narrator reads, the clearer it becomes. The real wisdom of the medieval world did not belong to kings or popes, but to the weary. Those who had seen too much found in their weariness a strange clarity. They stopped believing in glory, but they did not stop believing in goodness. Some found it in small acts, sharing bread with prisoners, nursing the sick, offering confession to the condemned. Others found it in silence, withdrawing from battlefields to tend gardens or mend tools. Their peace was not preached, but practiced. It was a wisdom born of fatigue, yet luminous in its humility. Among the archives of old monasteries, there are letters from aging knights who renounced their titles. One wrote that after decades of killing, I learned that to live gently is the hardest vow. Another described the strange calm that followed, confession not the priest's absolution, but the act of finally forgiving himself. These were men who had seen every lie the world could offer, and yet still chose kindness. In their quiet repentance, there lies the faint outline of redemption, not the grand redemption promised by the Church, but the human kind that begins in the heart and ends in the hands. Perhaps it was this unseen current, this underground river of compassion, that kept civilization from collapsing entirely. For every pyre, there was someone who whispered a prayer for the burning. For every sword raised, someone else bent to heal the wounded. They left no monuments because they did not need them. Their faith was not in stone, but in the fragile persistence of decency. In a world ruled by noise, they practiced silence. In an age of spectacle, they practiced patience. It was not power that kept the light alive, but grace. There are stories of old knights who became healers, men who traded swords for herbs and poultices. One tale tells of a warrior who built a hospice on the site of a battlefield where he had once slaughtered hundreds. He planted trees where bodies had fallen, saying each leaf was a name. The grove still stands, though the records of his deeds have faded. It is said that in the autumn wind, when the leaves tremble, it sounds like the murmuring of prayers. Perhaps that, too, is a kind of forgiveness, the earth remembering what men forgot. This wisdom, hidden and fragile, never sought to correct history. It simply endured it. These forgotten voices did not shout, they whispered. And because they whispered, they survived the flames. Their teachings drifted forward through time, finding refuge in the quiet corners of human behavior, in the mercy of strangers, in the resilience of those who love despite loss. The myth-makers built empires, but the gentle built continuity. It is through them that humanity learned to outlive its own violence. Their greatest strength wasn't how they fought, it was how they forgave. The line repeats in the narrator's mind as the evidence unfolds, as if those words had been written across centuries by invisible hands. The warrior who forgave became the truest heretic of all, defying every law that demanded vengeance. Forgiveness was rebellion in its purest form, a refusal to continue the cycle of justified cruelty. To forgive was to reclaim power from the systems that thrived on hatred. It was a declaration that humanity could choose softness, even after the world had turned to stone. The tone of the story shifts here, not triumphant, but tender. The narrator no longer speaks of empires or battles, but of endurance. The centuries of noise fall away, leaving only small human gestures glowing faintly in the dark. A hand extended, a wound tended, a prayer whispered for an enemy's soul. These fragments, fragile and almost lost, contain more truth than all the chronicles of conquest combined. They remind us that even in humanity's worst ages, something sacred persisted, not in temples or crowns, but in hearts that refused to harden. Forgiveness, patience, kindness. These were not miracles of faith, but of humanity. The real warriors were not the ones who killed for belief, but those who learned to live without bitterness. Their stories do not ask us to admire them, only to remember them. And in that remembrance, something ancient begins to heal. As the section closes, the narrator's voice softens further, like a candle nearing its wick. The myths of glory and righteousness have long since burned out, but their smoke still drifts through time. Yet beneath that haze, the faint light of real wisdom endures, not blinding, not triumphant, but steady. It waits for those willing to look into the shadows, where the truest lessons were always hidden. The next step, the narrator suggests, is simple yet profound. To remember, to honor not the conquerors, but the forgivers. To see in their silence the strength that built everything worth saving. For it is in remembrance, not victory, that peace finally begins. To remember them truthfully is to end the lie of glory forever. Every story we recover from the ashes is an act of quiet defiance, a spark against centuries of darkness. The church may have burned their names, the kings may have buried their words, and time itself may have worn their bones to dust. But memory is not bound by fire or by power. To remember is to rebel. It is to say, you tried to silence them, but they are still speaking. The narrator's voice slows here, softer now, like the hush of a candle flame in a cathedral long abandoned. This is not the tone of anger or accusation. It is reverence. For memory, when it survives, does not roar. It whispers. It seeps through the cracks left by the conquerors, reclaiming what was once stolen. History tells us who won, but memory tells us who endured. To remember truthfully, not the myths, not the marble saints, but the trembling, weary, kind humanity beneath, is to undo the oldest illusion of all, that power defines worth. There is rebellion in remembrance because it restores balance. Every erased name brought back to light diminishes the false grandeur of empires. Every forgotten act of mercy, every quiet defiance, loosens the foundations of the lie. Those who profit from myth depend on forgetting on our willingness to trade memory for comfort, complexity for clarity. But to remember the past as it truly was, in all its contradiction and pain, is to reclaim ownership of the human story. It is to take history out of the hands of the powerful and return it to the people who lived it. In monasteries and museums, in villages and ruins, fragments of the erased world still hide. A torn manuscript, a marginal note, a carving on stone, these are not relics of defeat but of resistance. Each fragment that survives says, "We were here. We mattered." To remember is to hear them again, to resurrect what centuries tried to drown in silence. The act itself becomes sacred. Not sacred as the Church once defined it, but sacred in a more human way, the holiness of truth reclaimed by those who refuse to forget. The knights who questioned heaven, the soldiers who forgave, the nameless who sang lullabies over graves, their legacy does not live in chronicles, but in the conscience of those who listen. Every generation that rediscovers them renews the rebellion. The myth of glory can only live so long as we forget the cost. The moment we remember the smell of the blood, the trembling of the hands, the quiet of the dying, the illusion collapses. The sword rusts again, and the truth, fragile but eternal, begins to breathe. To remember is not nostalgia. It is not longing for a better age that never existed. It is an act of clarity. It means seeing the past without its disguises and loving it anyway. To look at the cruelty and still find compassion, to face the horror and still choose understanding, this is the hardest form of courage. When we remember truthfully, we deny history its false comfort. We reject the polished tales and embrace the scars. Memory in that way is not a return, it is a reckoning. The narrator recalls an old proverb, found scribbled in the margin of a lost sermon. He who forgets becomes what he fears. Perhaps that is why forgetting has always been so convenient. To forget the cruelty of the past allows it to return disguised as progress. To forget the manipulation allows it to evolve with new names, new banners, new technologies. The knight on the battlefield becomes the soldier in the factory, the voice on the screen, the hand that obeys orders without question. The myth renews itself through amnesia. And so, remembering is not a sentimental act, it is survival. When we remember, we interrupt the cycle. We stand in the ruins of false history and refuse to let it close. We hold the silence open, even when it aches. The Inquisition, the wars, the fires, they all sought to control, not just what people believed, but what they could remember, because to shape memory is to shape the soul. That is why the forbidden stories were always the most dangerous. They did not teach rebellion. They were rebellion. They reminded people that authority could be wrong, that holiness could lie, that truth could survive without permission. In this quiet retelling, the narrator becomes a vessel for all those lost voices, not just the knights and scribes, but the mothers who buried sons, the monks who hid forbidden scrolls, the peasants who whispered prayers for both sides of a war. Their defiance was not loud, but enduring. They are the reason the light never fully went out. And so, to remember them now, in this age of noise and spectacle, is to continue their work. Every act of truthful remembrance is a refusal to let the lie be the last word. To remember them truthfully is to end the lie of glory forever. The stories we keep alive today are not for revenge, but for redemption. By remembering what was done in the name of faith, of power, of righteousness, we guard ourselves against repeating it. Memory is the conscience of time. It warns, it humbles, it heals. Forgetting flatters us, but remembering redeems us. And though the past cannot be changed, how we carry it can. The narrator's tone becomes almost a whisper, now a lullaby, a benediction. The story slows, inviting reflection. Perhaps the true rebellion is not to fight, but to see. To refuse to turn away from the truth, even when it makes us tremble. In that trembling lies our humanity. The knights once believed courage was found on the battlefield, but the real battlefield has always been within. To remember, to forgive, to remain kind in the face of horror, that is the courage history rarely honours, but always needs. And so, this remembrance becomes a ritual, not of worship, but of awakening. We light candles not for saints, but for those who were never canonized. We read the names carved faintly into stone, the letters preserved by chance, the songs that survived in fragments. We hold them in our minds, not as heroes or martyrs, but as people who lived, erred, and endured. To speak their truth aloud is to free them from silence, and in freeing them, we free ourselves. The night deepens, the voice softens. The world outside the story fades until only the listener and the memory remain. The narrator reminds us that the past does not ask for devotion, only acknowledgement. To remember truthfully is not to live in mourning, but to live awake. It is to understand that every generation inherits both the wounds and the wisdom of those who came before. To remember is to continue their rebellion against lies, against forgetting, against indifference. In this way, remembrance becomes a quiet kind of immortality. The knights who questioned heaven, the soldiers who forgave, the heretics who dared to think they live again each time their truth is spoken. The story is not theirs alone anymore. It belongs to us now, and how we carry it will decide what becomes of the next myth, the next age, the next illusion. The past cannot thank us for remembering, but if memory itself has a voice, it might say only this: do not let them fade again. When the last sword rusted, truth was all that remained, but no one listened. The age of banners had long since ended. The smoke of centuries had settled into the earth, and the fields that once ran red were green again. The castles stood as hollow shells, their towers eroded, their stones worn smooth by rain. Time had done what no army could. It had silenced the noise. The story opens not with a trumpet, but with thunder distant, low, like the voice of a world remembering itself. Rain falls softly over forgotten graves, washing away what history once tried to carve in permanence. The wind moves through ruined cloisters and empty halls, carrying fragments of chants once sung to glorify conquest. Now the echoes are for no one. The world listens to itself, and finds the sound strangely tender. In this quiet hour, the narrator returns to the myth, the great lie that promised meaning through might, holiness through harm, salvation through suffering. For 1,000 years, it had shaped empires, crowned kings, and sanctified every cruelty imaginable. But now, stripped of its pageantry, it feels like a ghost trying to remember its own name. The knight, that shining symbol of faith and valor, is no longer a hero or a heretic. He is a story, one that has finally grown tired of its own telling. The myth had always been loud. It needed to be. Lies survive in noise, in trumpets and sermons, in banners and applause. Truth, by contrast, survives only in silence. It waits for the noise to die down. It endures the centuries like stone beneath the ocean, unseen but unbroken. And when at last the voices of authority fade, the kings, the priests, the poets, the truth begins to whisper again. Not to accuse, not to boast, but simply to remind, this is what it really was. Rain continues to fall. In the distance a bell tolls, not for war, but for weather, a warning to shepherds, not to soldiers. The rhythm of life has returned to simplicity. The land no longer remembers who owned it, or who died defending it. It belongs again to the wind and the seeds. The narrator describes the scene with reverence, as though observing the world's slow forgiveness. History, once weaponized, now lies unarmed. It is strange, the narrator muses, how truth rarely triumphs in the moment. It doesn't win battles or build monuments. It survives instead by hiding in lullabies, in margins, in memories passed quietly between generations. Every empire thought it had destroyed it, yet somehow it always reappeared, in the kindness of a stranger, in a line of poetry no one could fully erase. The truth never fought back. It simply waited for us to get tired of lies. Now that waiting has ended. The age of illusion has burned itself out. The knights of glory, the priests of righteousness, the chroniclers of obedience, all gone. The silence left behind is immense, but not empty. It hums with something deeper, the faint resonance of understanding. For the first time in centuries, the story belongs to no one. It is no longer a tool of power, no longer a performance of virtue. It is a mirror. The narrator walks through a ruined chapel. The stained glass is shattered, but in the fragments, the rainlight still glows. A single candle burns where the altar used to stand, someone's quiet gesture, a wordless prayer. Perhaps for the dead, perhaps for the living. The ground smells of wet stone and dust. The narrator bends, runs a hand along the cold floor, and feels how smooth it has become. So many feet, so many centuries, and yet beneath it all, endurance. Outside, thunder rolls again, closer this time. The sound seems to echo through time itself. Each peal is an echo of something older than history, the raw music of existence, indifferent to our triumphs and defeats. The narrator's voice softens. This is what remains when the banners rot and the marble crumbles, the pulse of the world, steady and ancient. The myths may have lied, but the earth does not. It remembers without judgment. The rain grows heavier. The narrator describes how water seeps through the cracks of the chapel roof, dripping onto the stone, erasing the last traces of painted saints. Their eyes blur, their halos dissolve, until they are simply faces again, human, humble, almost kind. The rain, patient as time, undoes the illusions of perfection. It returns divinity to its origin, mortality. Somewhere in the distance, a bird calls a small, fragile sound against the vast quiet. The narrator listens as though it were the first voice ever heard. That is how truth enters, not with fanfare, but with gentleness. A single note of life amid centuries of echo. The myth had promised transcendence. Truth offers presence. It asks nothing, only that we see. The camera of the mind drifts through this landscape from ruins to fields, from rain to river, each image dissolving into the next, until time itself feels circular. The past and the present merge in the same rhythm. Rise, fall, return. The sword rusts, the hand decays, but the gesture remains, the reaching, the yearning, the forgiveness. The world does not forget, it transforms. And in that transformation lies redemption. The knights, the priests, the kings, all believed that salvation came from victory. But the truth whispers otherwise. Salvation comes from surrender. From laying down the weapon, from admitting we were wrong. The final absolution is not divine. It is human. It is the simple act of seeing the world as it is, and loving it anyway. The narrator pauses, as if listening for something beyond words. The thunder softens into distant rain. The candle flickers. The story, once full of violence and grandeur, now contracts to a single heartbeat, calm, steady, aware. The myth collapses not in defeat, but in completion. Its purpose, perhaps, was always to exhaust us, to lead us through illusion, until we could no longer bear the noise, until silence itself felt like revelation. In that silence, the listener is invited to breathe, to feel the weight of the centuries lift, replaced by the gentleness of knowing. The old world is gone, but the lesson remains. That truth needs no defenders, only witnesses. The echo ends not because the sound is weak, but because the world has learned to listen again. The narrator speaks of memory one last time, how it moves through generations like water, through stone, reshaping everything it touches. To remember is no longer rebellion, it is peace. The act of remembering becomes quiet, devotion not to glory, but to honesty. To those who forgive, to those who endure, to those who keep kindness alive even when the world forgets how. As the rain subsides, the air fills with the scent of earth renewal. The wind carries the faintest trace of a hymn, or perhaps it is imagination. The words are indistinct, but the feeling is clear. Gratitude, not for victory, but for survival, for the fragile persistence of truth. The narrator looks upon the ruins one last time. Moss climbs the stones where knights once carved their names. The marks of pride have become gardens. The irony is beautiful. The same walls that once defended illusions now shelter life. nature reclaims what men abandoned, turning monuments of arrogance into altars of humility. Every leaf, every raindrop, every root is a reminder that time forgives all things, not by forgetting them, but by integrating them into the rhythm of what remains. The final revelation comes not as an idea, but as a feeling, peace, the kind that does not need to justify itself, the kind that comes when the noise is gone and the heart stops arguing with the past. The narrator's tone becomes slower, almost like breathing. The words themselves begin to feel like rain, soft, rhythmic, cleansing. When the last sword rusted, the voice repeats, "Truth was all that remained." And in that truth, there is no triumph, no tragedy, only balance. The myths are gone, the lies exposed, the saints unpainted. What remains is the world, raw, quiet, enduring. The listener can almost hear the pulse of it, the heartbeat beneath the centuries. It is not heroic, but it is real. And that, the narrator suggests, is enough. The story lingers on this moment, refusing to rush. The rain fades into silence. The thunder dissolves into distance. A faint chorus hums not of angels or choirs, but of voices layered across time, human and fragile. They do not sing of victory, they hum remembrance. A tone that carries neither sorrow nor joy, only acceptance. The narrator reflects on what it means to end a story. Perhaps stories do not end at all. They return, transformed, waiting for someone new to listen differently. The myth of the night will be told again, in some new form, for some new age. It will wear new armor, speak new languages. But maybe, just maybe this time, it will carry its shadow with it. It will remember that beneath every legend there was a human being, small and afraid, trying to make sense of the dark. The voice grows softer still, almost indistinguishable from the sound of the rain. Truth, it says, is patient. It does not demand to be believed, it only asks to be seen. In that single line, the centuries seem to fold in on themselves. The wars, the faith, the betrayals, the fire, all of it reduced to one quiet moment of awareness. The candle at the altar finally dies. Smoke rises, curling upward like a final prayer. For an instant, the smoke catches the light from the shattered glass, turning to gold. Then it disperses, leaving only the faint scent of wax and rain. The echo ends, and with it, the age of noise. What remains is the listener alone, awake, surrounded by silence that feels alive. It is not emptiness, but presence. The silence of truth does not erase. It includes. It holds everything, the myths, the lies, the forgiveness, the pain, and lets them rest. This, the narrator realizes, is the peace history never gave. The kind that comes not from victory, but from release. Outside, dawn begins to bloom. The clouds thin, the light seeps gently into the ruins, revealing what the darkness had concealed. The world, stripped of illusion, looks softer now. The grass glows faintly, jeweled with rain. A bird lands on the broken spire, shaking water from its wings. The sky, once heavy with thunder, opens to quiet blue. It feels like a beginning not of a new age, but of awareness itself. The narrator's final words are almost inaudible. Listen, the world is still speaking. And it is in the rustle of leaves, in the slow trickle of rain down the stone, in the hush between breaths. The myth may be over, but the music continues. The truth, once buried beneath centuries of noise, hums again beneath the surface of all things. When the last sword rusted, truth was all that remained, but no one listened. Perhaps now, at last, someone does.